All right, the House Government Oversight, the Joint Government Oversight Committee meeting will be back in session. Just a quick reminder for those that are in the audience, please do your best to keep quiet. We are doing our best to get this information out to you. Please keep your cell phone silenced, and applause are not allowed. This is a regular committee meeting, so we're trying to get information out of folks. And just as a reminder for those of you that raised your hands, this is a special committee meeting, so we're going to be limiting the questions to members here on the committee. We have 60 minutes left. If we could have the two folks from the Department of Human Services come back up. We have 60 minutes left. We have people that have scheduled their days around their presentation, so I am going to make sure that we stay on time. We have 5 people yet on the list. Coming up, we have Representative Hartsell, then Thiede, then Senator Breitbach, then Senator Peterson, then Senator McCoy. So right now, we have less than an hour to get through those 5, so if you could please keep your comments as short as possible so everybody that wants to talk gets an opportunity to talk. And as always, if we have extra time and you want to talk again, please indicate. So with that, I will turn the floor over. Chair recognizes Representative Hartsell to continue his questions on the presenters of DHS.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you both for being here today. Appreciate your time with us. So I'll just cut right into my questions here. Of the cases where there's children removed from the home, could you give us an idea of what percentage of that involves drug use?
Do you have specific figures, Vern? So I can get you. We are better able to determine specific figures over the last year or so than we were previously. So we started to track some things differently. In general, a huge percentage of our cases involve substances, whether used by mom and dad, by other family members, or on the delinquency side by kids. So it is a prevalent problem.
And so I know you've mentioned this before, that the goal is reunification of the family, of the core family. So what is the criteria, if you can give us high level, what's the criteria for determining whether parental rights are terminated or reunifying the family?
So for reunification, the general criteria are to ensure that parents have a clean and sober life that allows their kids to live with them safely. And that's kind of the initial run at things. If that is not accomplished over time, then we look at terminating parental rights. So parents are given, really, in our system, pretty ample opportunity to get those things straightened around in a way that makes sense. If they can't, then there's a termination of parental rights. What I would say, for those folks who are really good at addiction, and I am not an addiction specialist, there is an inherent cycle in how people stop using substances. So you don't necessarily stop once and then you're done. You go into treatment, you come out, you may relapse. So we do try to take that into account in our thinking with kids and their parents to try to understand those cycles. But in general, we want people to be sober parents and good parents, and if they can't do that, that's when termination occurs.
What type of testing is done on parents?
You know, we use a variety of drug tests and done at a variety of different times. So we use urine tests, we use blood tests, we use hair stat tests, we use a large menu of tests. And the frequency is kind of determined on which test it is and how effective it is and for what substances it's effective. So we use a variety of tests over a variety of period of time depending on what the family is presenting us with.
So there's not any one set of tests? I mean, you don't always use hair tests?
No.
You don't always use urinal? Okay.
We have a whole toolkit of tests that are used regularly.
Okay. Do you have like an algorithm or something you follow as far as depending on the severity of the case on what type of testing to make sure that someone is getting clean? Is that something that you have a protocol that you follow then?
We do have a drug testing protocol, and the type of test, again, is predicated more on what type of substance we're looking for and what kind of substances that particular test is best with. If we don't know, if we're not sure, so the parents are saying, well, maybe I used pot once, but if we are not sure, then we tend to use a variety of those tests because they'll catch more substances and then we can be more sure.
Okay. A question regarding the subsidies. You mentioned earlier, Ms. Rickman, that you can and do stop subsidies from going to foster or adoptive parents. What criteria would that? Does there have to be a allegation of abuse, or is there things that you potentially see before any allegation comes to your knowledge that would stop stop a subsidy from moving
So
forward?
if we start from the federal expectation is that subsidies are only stopped with the permission of the adoptive parent. From a common sense perspective, and I don't remember several of you have mentioned common sense today. Oh, Lance, I guess. We stop subsidies if it is apparent that those parents are no longer providing support to their kids. So outside the cases that kind of brought us here today, one example, the typical example that I see when we make the decision to stop a subsidy, a parent, an adoptive parent, ends up back in juvenile court with a China petition. Their child is placed in a residential treatment facility, a group care facility. They basically say, we're not coming to visit. We're not interested in being part of it. We'll talk about whether we want this child back at some point. We end the subsidy. That is not providing day-to-day support to those kids. So those are the kind of situations where we would end a subsidy. It is typically when parents are no longer willing to provide support for those kids.
Okay, so apart from that, there's really no way to track that as far, let's say a foster parent family, foster parents adopt, they move to a different location. Is there any way, and the subsidies, is there anyone that's following up on that? I was just looking over here at subsidized adoptions. They're basically, once they become adopted, they become the parent, there is no longer any oversight as far as what I'm understanding from DHS. So then how would you know whether or not they're providing that care that would warrant that subsidy?
The most common way that we know that there's a problem is because there'll be a new abuse referral. So somebody will turn that in and say, we have a family who is not providing mental health care, or we have a family where there's physical abuse. So it will come back in through that child abuse piece, right, and then flow through the system. You're absolutely right, though, in terms of continuing to oversee adoptive families once the adoption is finalized, that does not occur today.
But a report or an allegation of child abuse could trigger possibly the ending of these subsidies if...
That's correct.
Okay.
And if there is an allegation of abuse or neglect on an adoptive parent, a parent who has finalized their adoption, it also is ineligible to go down that family assessment path. So it automatically has to be assessed through the child abuse path. So it's another little layer that we have put in.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Ms. Rickman.
I recognize Representative Thede.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you guys for coming. I really do appreciate it. This helps enlighten us on what we need to do. It's a little bit better. I want you to walk me through, I want to talk about the social worker, whether it be a 2 or a 3. And let me kind of do it this way. So I am a brand new social worker, just graduated out of college. I'm 23 years old. Well, not really, but anyway, I'm just coming out, graduated. I'm getting ready to come into your system. You're going to give me the necessary things that I need to know to be a good social worker. But what happens in light of what happened with the 2 children that have died? What happens, what kind of training is provided to that adult, to that young adult that now is going through quite a bit of something that she had not expected? We always have, experience as a good teacher, but oftentimes there's so many things that go on that are not necessarily going to happen, maybe necessarily in that lifetime. But what kind of training is offered to that young person or to anyone? It doesn't have to be a 23-year-old, it could be anyone. What kind of training is offered? And then is there some sort of, and I listened to the attorney, she said that there was nothing, that person's just out there. So tell me, and if you haven't done anything, if you have not done anything moving forward, is there plans in this new assessment piece that you guys talked about earlier, is there plans to deal with this, on a scale that will help social workers be more successful? Now, let me ask one other question too. And I'll just get them all in so that we don't have to go back and forth. And I think the other thing about this is that if I come from a background Where I have not been, I'm not aware of poverty, I'm not aware of drugs, I'm not aware of all those things. Again, I know experience as a teacher for that. But again, is there some sort of knowledge base, training base, something that's out there that allows the person who is in the trenches to make sure that they understand all these things that are going on and also have the training for all this? So if you could kind of elaborate on some of that, that would be helpful.
I'll take that one. So when we hire a new worker, and usually our hiring process right now is we hire people with experience a great deal of the time, quite honestly. When we hire people, a lot of times they've worked in our private agencies before, maybe providing family safety, risk, and permanency services, et cetera. And so they do have some experience. But a new worker comes in and gets training. Social worker 2 gets about 160 hours of new worker training. Social worker 3, a little over 150 hours of new worker training. And that consists of everything from testifying in court, how to write case plans, et cetera. That training is both a combination of in-person training, on-the-job training, experiential training, some online training, et cetera. And then we require our workers to get 24 hours of training every single year to continue their training and upgrade it. As far as what was mentioned before about traumatic events, et cetera, some of those trainings deal with how to take care of yourself personally, how, when you're in a helping profession, seeing some of the things that she mentioned before. But in addition to training, we do offer an employee assistance program as well, where we have trained counselors come in and be available to people if they want to take advantage of that to work through those individual situations.
Okay, you said for social worker 3, how many hours of training?
About 152 hours
And then
of
how
new
many
worker
for
training.
the 2?
160. Not much difference.
Okay. So let me give you another example real quick, and then I'll be done here because I know the other folks that want to talk. So I worked for the school system for 28 years. My job was truancy. And a couple of things that we did something called we had to attend a training for poverty-level families. And at the end of the training, it was very frustrating. I did everything I shouldn't have done at the end to get to the goal where I had to get to. And that was we had to use time in order to fulfill all the things that we did. I learned at the end that I was not capable enough to do that, and that was very, very frustrating. So I can't imagine a social worker going into a situation, and even though, they're trained, I guess my concern is, and you did answer this, you did say that there's some other things, they're kind of a debriefing, is that what that is? If a traumatic situation happens, is that true? Okay. All right, so I guess, like in this situation, is there moving forward, and this is my last question, moving forward, even though you do a debriefing, is there going to be something done in this assessment piece in the third party that you talked about earlier? Is there going to be something else done?
Okay. 3 things to that, and then you can jump in, Wendy, if you want to. So training on experiences that somebody new out of school hasn't had yet, whether it's we do training on poverty, we do training on race, we do trainings to get them sensitized to dealing with those situations they haven't been exposed to before. We do a lot of role playing in our trainings as well to get them used to dealing with families and engaging with families they may not have been exposed to before, quite honestly, in Iowa. The other thing to consider, though, is our supervisors are key as well. And our supervisors sign off on every child abuse report. They sign off on every case plan. And so the supervisors are providing good clinical supervision and consultation with their workers as well. So the worker's not out there alone making those very critical decisions all by themselves, especially when they're brand new. As far as how we support our workers after traumatic events like this, I mentioned employee assistance, but that is something, as Wendy mentioned, we're still kind of working out the exact dimensions of this third-party review. That's something that we've always I've always wanted to pay attention to. We've been scouring some other federal stuff as well. So yes, I hope it's in there. I think it will.
Thank you. Chair recognizes Senator Breitbach.
Thank you, and thank you for coming to appear before us. Do you feel that children that have been foster kids and eventually are adopted by the foster parents, and if they are still receiving a stipend, that we should continue to monitor those kids? I know normally after a child is adopted, we discontinue monitoring those children, but in that particular case when they're a hard to place child or special needs child and they're going to receive a stipend, should the department continue to oversee them and do welfare checks on them?
I think that certainly is one of the topics that we want to explore. There are positives and negatives to that kind of response. And so, my sense is that just saying that when a parent becomes aware, or when we become of a parent problem because it comes back in through abuse and neglect, I'm not sure that that's enough. So it certainly is on the agenda to talk about. At this point, I honestly do not have a position. And to be frank with you, where I get hung up on it is we finalize adoptions and make people parents. What right do we have then to go in and say, oh, and by the way, you're a parent, but because you get this money, we need to do this and that. So I think it's a very fair question, and I think it's something we're going to have to wrestle with. I honestly do not have an opinion at this point about which way we should go due to the things that I've talked about. Does that make sense? Burnout? No, if you have another opinion.
No, I think it's the same thing. I think we come in making assumptions, having our own opinions on things as well. To Wendy's point, I think it is something that we will have to wrestle with. We have always in this state believed once an adoption is final, they are the parent. They should be treated like any other parent. And just as Wendy mentioned, just because they receive a subsidy for adoption, they may be receiving other state benefits for other programs as well. Does that give the state the obligation or the right to interfere in their lives again? I think it's a fair policy question.
If a decision was made that we would do additional follow-up, would that require a legislative action, or would it just be a rule change within your department?
It would require legislative action. And I think then depending on, I think the conversation would be what kind of follow-up would we require, and all the things that came from that. But at this point, it would require a code change, I believe. So,
Chair recognizes Senator Peterson.
Thank you. I have some follow-up questions from this morning. You talked about having checks and balances for the home study. I am unclear, based on the home study that is outsourced, if you let the company selected or the organization selected to handle the home study, do they as well get to outsource that component?
the only way that they would be able to outsource it is through a subcontract. So, for example, when in Four Oaks master contract, that is who we hold the contract with. They have subcontracted with Children's Square in the West or with Lutheran Services of Iowa to assist with those services. The primary contract is with Four Oaks. They are expected to manage their subcontractors. In the cross kind of decision conversation, it really is more of a check and balance between a provider that we ask to gather materials, our independent review of those materials, asking additional questions, and then us making a final decision. But there are subcontractors within the structure.
So are you saying the buck stops with DHS reviews all home studies that have been submitted for foster care and adoptive care?
Yes.
So was there a common thread among the most recent cases of, did anybody go back and review the home care study in those cases?
So we are in the process of reviewing all of the documents and things that from our interactions from any of these families. And, you know, I'm not going to comment on the specific reviews that were done in specific cases. What I can tell you are the questions that Vern and I have talked about are things like, do we ask the right things during a home study process? If you go look at what's required to give us a home study, there are a bazillion things we want to find out. Part of what we want to ask is, are those the right things? Are they giving us the best information to make the best decision? Because, you know, going back to this morning a little bit, there is nobody that's going to sit and tell us they intentionally want to harm our kids. So
I
that
guess
is
my
where we
question
are.
is, does anybody mystery shop to make sure that home study actually occurred?
I'm sorry, I don't understand. Say that again.
Does
Mystery
anyone
shop?
from the department ever like go back and check the work to make sure the home study actually occurred?
Sure, we do, in terms of that line level review from a worker's perspective happens with each and every home study. As it relates to foster parents in general or the work of the organization, then that oversight is set through a whole series of things that they report to us on, that we quality assurance check. So at different levels, there are lots of checks going back and forth. So to say, like, if the concern would be that somebody just turned in a packet and didn't really do the work, I would say that's highly unlikely. I think more likely is either not assessing things as deeply as we could, or us from a structural perspective not having the right stuff that we're asking for.
I want to go back to, are we seeing trends in the number of abuse calls coming into DHS? Do you track the number of abuse calls that are foster parents?
That are turned in with foster parents as perpetrators? Yes, we do.
How many did we have last year on foster parents?
Do you know, Vern? We'll get it for you. We track that. And again, if a referral comes in on a foster parent, they will flow down that child abuse assessment path and are ineligible to go down that other side. So we have that data.
Do we track whether or not that parent is doing homeschool or public education or private school?
We do not, in a
Okay.
systemic way, track that today.
Okay. What about number of adoptive family abuse calls into DHS? Do we track that?
Yes.
Do you know off the top of your head how many past
I
couple
don't.
years?
No, the other thing with that, though, is we may not know they're an adoptive parent up front. When somebody calls us, they may not know the child's adopted.
Are the calls to intake recorded?
The calls to centralized intake are recorded, yes.
And are they stored?
Yes. I do want to clarify, as long as there isn't any kind of technology problem with something. That once in a while, we do have a worker's phone go offline, et cetera, but 99% of the time, yes, they're recorded and stored.
And that you had answered Representative Finkenauer's question differently than I received an answer from DHS earlier. My understanding was that parents whose children are in a foster care setting had to approve themselves whether or not they allowed their child to be homeschooled. And I believe when you answered Representative Finkenauer's question this morning, you said a judge made that decision.
So that's a really good distinction. Parents are part of that family team that help make the decision about whether a child should be homeschooled when they're in foster care, because we're just a custodian as a state. We're not the guardian at that time in the case. So when we talk about judges approving, that becomes part of the case plan, and judges sign off on case plans. So it is really a consistent answer, but it's different parts of the same answer. The family team will decide if a child is appropriate to be homeschooled when they're in foster care. That does include the parent. But then a judge also, in that checks and balances piece, could say, you know what, I don't think this is the best idea. You know, otherwise, they approve that case plan, and that is one component.
Are you saying the judge could only overrule to not have the child go to homeschool?
The judge
Judge can
do
overrule
anything.
either way.
Yes.
So
Yes.
basically, you are saying it's not the parent's choice, it's the judge's choice on whether or
In the
not.
end, that's true. In the end, that approval happens that way. We
Okay.
just, on our side, before that recommendation is made in a case plan, we ensure that we're including the parents And that foster parents understand they do not have the ability to do that unilaterally, so they can't just decide that on their own. With the discussions we've had about prudent parenting as it relates to all the new sex trafficking bills, foster parents are able to make some decisions about kids that they weren't previously able to make unilaterally. This is not one. They
Okay.
cannot decide by themselves.
Okay, so to get back to Representative Finkenauer's point, it would be possible to determine if the number of children that are foster care children that are being placed in homeschool environments.
Yes, and what I answered, I think, this morning is that it is possible. The issue is that we don't track that in our system. So we would have to go worker by worker, case by case to figure it out. But yes, the data is available.
I mean, you would think that that would be a higher trigger because now you've pulled kids out of having any exposure to mandatory reporters in different settings.
Sure. So to your point exactly, one of the things that we've talked about, one of the things on our to be discussed bucket, I guess, we would have the ability to prohibit homeschooling for foster children. That's an option. We just haven't done it. We had a process that we thought was in place, that we thought was pretty solid by involving everybody and having judges approve it. From a policy perspective, we could say, you know, because we are custodian of these kids, we're not going to allow them to be homeschooled at all. It will impact some of the foster parents we have in our system who want to homeschool. So there's always kind of a conversation to be had, but yes, you're absolutely right.
Well, I think it's an important part for our committee to think about because I can imagine some parent in a small town, there's not very many foster parents available. The one in their town maybe wants to homeschool, and they're making a decision not in what's necessarily in the best interest of the child, but they think is the only option for them for a reunification plan.
I
So I think
understand.
we very much need to think that through. You also had said that the rejected cases go to the county attorneys, and that was our check, but then we just heard from the county attorney's office, Polk County doesn't even review those. So clearly our checks and balances are not working if each county attorney's office gets to decide if they read them, if they don't read them, or what they do with them. So that's clearly a problem. And then last night we received a report that you're bringing in an organization, I believe you and the governor's office have decided to bring in an organization for 6 meetings, and you will be establishing what's reviewed. And I would imagine that a lot of Iowans would prefer, if we're really going to review what's going on, the department shouldn't be in charge of their own investigation, that it should be autonomous. Do you have any comments you'd like to make to that?
You know, I do. If I did not set the right impression this morning, let me do that. The group that was selected because they have a long history of being autonomous reviewers. As it relates to the department's function in that, I'm responsible to ensure that there's a contract. I'm responsible to make sure that we have, you know, that we have an ability to communicate back and forth. In terms of the agenda that gets set, as I said this morning, and we've continued to talk about, there are things on my little bucket list that I would like to at least throw on the table. We have never said in this third-party review that it is a totally department-driven, department-managed, department-centric perspective. So, for example, you know, we've reached out to the Ombudsman's office to say, we have these folks coming to town, we want you to weigh in. We've talked to our provider community, we've talked to kids, our kids groups and our parents groups. We're inviting you to participate. So the idea that the department is going to run this show in order to ensure that whatever message we think is important gets out is not the way it's going to go. And I would encourage you to keep an eye on it, because I think that is not where we're headed at all. I have a high level of confidence that we're going to gain perspective from all kinds of people in this process. That's the only way we're going to get to better answers. So I really would encourage you to keep our feet to the fire with that, to actively participate. And while we do have to functionally do some things to ensure we get people out here and they know where they are and we give them all of our policies, the direction that we head from there, I think, is going to be theirs to determine going forward.
Well, you're establishing the contract for the review, and you're establishing who participates in the review. To me, that is not being autonomous to really give them the full authority to review your department, your partners, and so I guess I would like to see an outside, the ability of the ombudsman or someone outside, and hopefully this committee will continue to keep doing reviews. I know it's difficult. Not everybody has someone who pays a paycheck that's not DHS that could come here and give the straight scoop on what's going on out there. And so I just have concerns, one, that we got this late last night, and two, how it's transpiring.
Chair recognizes Senator McCoy.
Thank you. Following up on Senator Peterson's question, I too share her concern. Last year we had 20 kids in Iowa that died at the hands of parents or caregivers, and according to Des Moines Register Reader Watchdog, when they investigated, they found 15 of the 20 children were subject to previous child abuse reports. And then when I learned today that the county attorneys in Polk County, the most populous county in the state, who receives the rejected reports, is not even getting a copy of the reports, or is getting a copy but not reviewing them, that to me is just outrageous that that's happening in the state of Iowa. We've got to fix that. That's a major problem, and we were led to believe as legislators on many occasions when a rejection went in that the county attorney was getting the copy and reviewing it. Was that your understanding? Were you aware that Polk County was not reviewing those prior to today's testimony by the assistant county attorney in Polk?
No, I was aware that practice is somewhat varied across the state, and that each county attorney sets their own kind of office policy around it. To be totally honest about it,
I like honesty, so be totally honest.
To be totally honest about it,
because
the stuff that I've been involved in is to make sure the county attorneys get the information. So, for example, when I was in the Davenport service area, we had a case that was bad, and when I started to ask about the county attorney's response to that, what I found out is that we had quit sending rejected intakes to them because they weren't reading them. They were just setting them in a pile and they were shredding them. No, our obligation is to follow the law. We will get them to them. Their obligation is to do something with them, and we'll help to navigate that if we can. So I was aware that things were...
If they're not being read, that is criminal, in my opinion. If we could move to this family assessment, one of the things that this risk assessment, or this alternative risk assessment, where we use outside groups, where we put a risk factor and we consider these cases low risk, we use the alternative method to assess the family situation. It's my understanding that's a voluntary process. Is that correct?
Yes.
And if a family takes advantage of it initially and drops off, then what kind of follow-up is done by the department to assure that that there's something happening that's positive long-term?
So the family assessments are voluntary, yes, but it is the same workers who do the child abuse assessments who also do those family assessments. If a family is not cooperating in a family assessment, then our workers have the opportunity to reassign those and to request China petitions, and that's what they're instructed to do. So at the point that a family is no longer voluntary, the basic DHS decision is, does their unwillingness to cooperate warrant further action, because now kids are unsafe? And we have several cases every year, about 800 of them last year, that happened, where workers then went back and said, no, if you're not going to cooperate over here, we're going to finish the case over here and we'll request a petition because your kids are unsafe.
And that happened 800 times?
About 800 times last year.
Out of how many entered into a voluntary?
I'd have to look at the numbers of how many flowed down that path. It was about 12% maybe that got reassigned. Now, let me say this though, not all of those got reassigned because somebody wasn't cooperating. Sometimes they get reassigned because you get a certain amount of information at the point of a call. I am worried about this mom because I think that she's not supervising well. You get out there and you sit down with mom and her kids and you see a handprint on somebody's face. That case then gets reassigned. So we don't finish that family assessment. It goes to the other side because it's more serious than you thought. So, Senator, all I'm saying is that there are a variety of circumstances that move these cases from the family assessment path to the other, and that we have intentionally done that to ensure that we are giving the appropriate response to the situation we find ourselves in with the family. As it relates to the private providers, which you referenced, so at the end of the family assessment, we give it a risk level. We give the family a risk level, and there are voluntary services available to them that are carried out by a contractor. The instruction to our contractor is, if this family quits cooperating with you and you think it needs attention, you turn it back in, and we'll take a look at it. So so when we talk about checks and balances, those are the checks and balances that are built in. I think to your point, do we need to see if they're all functioning the way they're supposed to? That is very fair. But I would tell you that they're built in inherently to the way these things flow.
So given this news today that the Assistant County Attorney in Polk made, and what you know now about family assessments, is part of your recommendation to this Alabama group that you hired last night to come in here and investigate for you, is part of that recommendation to look at these rejected cases that are going to county attorneys and getting shredded?
I think there are a couple. That would be one, yes, that I think we should take a look at that. The second that Lance Herron brought up is that today, at the end of that family assessment, county attorneys do not automatically get a copy of that report. They will get a copy of it when we request a China petition. So
Okay.
if the family doesn't cooperate and we say, oh, no, we're going to court, then they get all that information. I think what he was saying today is that he believes that by not getting that initial family assessment, they may be missing something in the county attorney's office. Today, we follow the law. The law says they don't get it.
Okay.
That would be an area that we would take a look at as well in terms of those family assessments, how they flow. Does that make sense?
Yep. And Vern, my question to you before I get cut off, before I ran out of time, was simply, why am I so disconnected with the caseworkers, the dozens and dozens of caseworkers that I'm talking to confidentially, because they're all afraid they're going to lose their job for talking to me. But why am I so disconnected from them on the number of cases that they say they're carrying when I get data back that says they're carrying 13 cases, and every one of them said they don't know anybody carrying 13 cases, and that this is a complete whitewash of what is actually going on out there in the department. And when I sit here and I hear a county attorney from the most populous county talk about caseloads of 50 cases, I was born in 1966, so not yesterday. I'm 50 years old. I think I know when I'm being snowed, and I'm being snowed on these statistics because I'm talking to enough caseworkers that are telling me what you say ain't so. So what's your response to that?
I would never say my caseworkers are telling you inaccurate information, okay? I would tell you how these numbers are derived. So for caseload information, it's very simple. It's the number of assessments done in a year divided by the number of FTEs. And that's just...
What's the number of FTEs, and are they the group that make up the 178 that I've counted one by one and looked at each of their overtime and their excessive overtime?
Okay. So the numbers you were provided before, which come out to the 12, do include the 25 workers in centralized intake. So, for example, for fiscal year 16, the number that we had for a caseload was 11.5. Take out the centralized intake, it's 13.2. It's simply a matter of we average the monthly average number of cases and divide it by the number of FTEs.
So how is it that the Polk County ones have 50 cases and the ones then, are you telling me the ones in rural Iowa have 2 cases?
Well, there are a couple things to consider. We have to be really, really careful when we're talking, whether we're talking social worker 2s or social worker 3s.
3s.
It makes a real difference
Yes,
on
it does.
caseload numbers.
Yeah, because one's monitoring and managing and...
Exactly.
and those are the 2s.
And
I'm talking about social worker
Yes.
3s.
So social worker 3s, on a day-to-day basis, their caseload is going to change every single day. What we're telling you is about 12 to 14 new assessments get assigned per worker per month. Okay? So at any one time, they could be picking up new cases, closing out cases. The other thing to consider, especially in smaller offices, is when you have 2 workers, but one of them is gone for vacation, one of them is gone on FMLA, maternity leave, any reason that they're gone. They're in a day of training. That other worker is picking up those additional cases as well. So when you look at the office, the average is going to be one thing, but on that day, that one worker is picking up a lot more. 2 other things I want to point out to you. We have had an increase in intakes in the last few months. I don't want anybody to think that the numbers are going down at the moment. Our number of intakes are going up, and the number of assessments that we're accepting are going up. And so right now, our workers are feeling overwhelmed. One thing to point out, though, in that the number of assessments going up that we're accepting is because we're splitting off reports that we didn't before. So, for example, a worker was out there for a neglect referral, lack of supervision, and they saw that there was physical abuse going on as well. Before they kind of wrapped that into the same report, now we're having them report that back in. And so it's turning into 2 reports for them because they're doing that extra work, and we want them to get the credit for doing that extra work.
And if a worker has 5 kids at one location, each of those cases count as 1.
It depends. So if I go into a family who has 5 children,
Yep.
it's one case, usually.
Yep.
If it's 2 separate fathers, because of how we have to separate the reports out, I may have 2 cases on those exact same 5 kids. It may turn into 5. I may go out on a child care home. It's 1 referral when I go out there, but I find out I have to open up 10 new cases all of a sudden. And they do that, and they do a great job at it. So all of a sudden, my caseload just exploded by 10 today. What happens is our people monitor that all the time. You bring up Polk County, they've got a couple people watching this. And it's our supervisor's responsibility when they see somebody picked up 10 cases in a day because the investigation went a different way than they thought, then they pull them out of rotation, or they should. So they're not getting new cases assigned for a while they finish those out. We manage that caseload to the best of our ability. There's no way for us to necessarily manage all of the reports coming in because we don't want to reject reports inappropriately or tamp that down. So all the reports that come in, they get assigned out. And it just depends on who's working that day. So
thank you. I guess one of the things I'd like to see this committee do is ask for a random sequential selection of 10% of the 180 caseworkers and have 10% of them answer a questionnaire truthfully about how many cases they're carrying, because I do not believe the data that we're getting based upon the volume of emails that I'm receiving from state employees who are telling me this is complete nonsense and it's not reality. So I'd like to see us do that as a checkpoint. I'm deeply concerned about this study by the Alabama group that was put together by the DHS director, who I think is the problem at DHS under his leadership, and making the decision with the governor's office out of consultation with any other elected officials in the state of Iowa or the people that are closely involved in this case, including the Oversight Committee, to do a $39,000 cursory study of systems and processes and come back with what I consider a blanket report which really doesn't delve into the issues that I think are systematic and deeply rooted within this department. And I think $39,000 wouldn't scratch the surface of a true study. And I don't like the way this was selected. And I got my email today announcing this at 9:39, so I guess we'll call that the Monday surprise. Thank you.
Senator, if I could, that is just not accurate. That is just not accurate. So let me just be clear.
What is not accurate? Because I said a lot.
The part about the third party, the part about the third party, there was a sense of urgency based on our current situation to get somebody into this state to help us structure a more in-depth review. My job was to give our leadership at the governor's office and our director choices to make the best decision about who could do that job, and to get a contract in place that could get somebody on the ground. The contract that you were made aware of does include up to 6 visits for these folks to come out here to help us structure what has to happen next. It is a first step based on getting them out here, letting them meet with a myriad of folks that have an opinion about this stuff, get them an overview of how the system is intended to function today, and then we'll decide what to do next. So it is not cursory. It is not I'll send you the contract shell. It is intended to get them on the ground quickly. I have a high level of confidence that they're very competent to do an autonomous program evaluation. But it is not the intent to just have somebody run out here, do a report, and be done. We will not stand for it. We will not. So, however we
I
need
would
to do
just
to
point
make
out we
everybody
had we had 20 child deaths. 15 of them had previous child abuse reports. 15 of the 20.
Yes.
So the sense of urgency really didn't occur until Sabrina Ray's case was brought to light. And that's when the department decided, oh, we've got to act, in my opinion. And I believe I believe that what was presented today and the way this came out at 9:39 without even consultation of any of the ranking members or chairs of the Oversight Committee was an attempt by the department to deflect, dodge, and dissuade legislators from asking the tough questions. And I can tell you, it didn't work with me. I'm not interested in the shell of your contract. I'm interested in where you're going with the contract. I want to read the contract word for word, and I'll spend my next weekend reading that contract, just like I spent this weekend reading your RFPs for KidsNet and Lutheran Social Services. This is a very important issue, and most of us are not backing up on this issue, and we're not going away. And we're going to be here till as long as it takes, and we're going to ask the really tough questions. And right now, I'm not convinced. I have low confidence in the information I'm getting back from the department. And the fact that I was stonewalled the entire last session while I was trying to get details
Senator,
from
we have
the
5 minutes left.
department,
You wrap
and the
up. Senator.
department was not, and the department
Senator,
was, and
this
the
meeting will be in order.
The department was not.
Senator McCoy, you are out of
answering my
order.
question.
I run this meeting. Senator McCoy, Senator Breitbach runs this meeting. We all have an opportunity to talk, and you are not going to take over this meeting. Please conclude your point. You are out of order, and wrap it up, please.
You are done. You've been talking for over 15, 20 minutes. It's time for somebody else to be able to ask a question. Thank you, Senator McCoy.
All right.
And so,
You're out.
Senator McCoy,
I thought I was told to
done.
wrap
you're
it
done.
up.
You've been 20 minutes. You've taken up 45 minutes of our 2.5 hours so far. Madam, I'm sorry.
Exit her. If she talks again, she's out.
Now,
Go ahead.
we're going to wrap this up. I have one final question. Senator Breitbach has one final question. Then we have other presenters who would like to speak. My question for you guys is, do you have any sort of a recommendation or an idea on how long this review is intended to take? Because that'll affect our work quite a bit.
Yes, sir. So in the original scope of the contract, we said up to a year. All we were trying to do was establish a parameter from a time frame perspective. The intent to have them on the ground soon and working soon will give us a better sense, and we will certainly keep folks updated as to how that goes. But the original contract is for up to a year.
Thank you, and I know that we're running out of time. I just had a question. Polk County apparently is not following up on China petitions from the testimony that we heard today. Is that correct?
I think what Andrea was talking about, whether we accept a case or reject it, they get a copy. I think what she was articulating is that due to their workload, they have a hard time with a structure to review all of those things that we reject. So one of the things that Vern and I talked about over our lunch break is that we'll get in touch with. We have a great relationship with the Polk County Attorney's Office at the local level and from a statewide perspective. We'll help them look into that a bit and see if we can't figure out a way to address that some.
So
They're filing petitions on time and they're, you know, they're following petitions. They're doing a great job of representing the state in their work. But I think what she was talking about were rejected intakes that come over to them in big piles.
So they wouldn't be China reports?
Correct.
They would just be the rejected ones?
Yes, just the
And
rejected
then we
was
would
what I
have,
heard.
then we're going to be looking into whether we're going
Whether
to be
we can
following
help
up,
them figure that out.
and
in
whether
terms
we're
of
going to be
getting-
following up on those
Yes.
non-China reports that have been dismissed by the, and would this, if they have a problem with that, would that fall under the DHS or would that fall under judiciary?
It would fall under the county attorney's office.
Okay.
So, but we would help with that. They get voluminous piles of paper, so if we can be helpful in categorizing things, or we'd talk through with that with them.
Thank you.
Thank you both for your time. I'm sure we'll have follow-up questions and we'll be in touch. Next up, we have District Associate. We're going to continue on our judicial process overview. I'd like to call up for his words, District Associate Judge Colin J. Witt. Is he with us? Thank you for your time, and we have 30 minutes, so feel free to present whatever you'd like, and then if you'd be okay with a few questions afterwards.
Thank you. So my name's Colin Witt. I'm a District Associate Judge in Polk County. I have been doing juvenile court work since the end of 2009, and I'm one of 6 juvenile court judges in Polk County. When I started, there were 4 of us, and that has varied between 4, 5, and 6 over a variety of time. As I understand it, the primary purpose is on child care placement today, and I'm happy to answer any and all questions that you would have, but I thought it might be helpful to just walk you through a placement process and how cases come to me or to a juvenile court judge. So a child welfare case would typically come to us one of 2 ways. Either the county attorney would be requesting a removal of a child or children from a parent or guardian or other, and that comes through 23278, the ex parte process, where it's an affidavit that's filed. The Department of Human Services, presumably the child protective worker, the social worker 3, has performed their investigation, communicated with the county attorney, and then done a variety of other work that they need to do, hopefully do what's called a pre-removal conference to try and figure out where the child or children should go so they can be in the least restrictive setting possible. So that might be a non-custodial parent, that might be a grandparent, an aunt, or other relative. In certain cases, it might be a suitable person placement, a member of the church, or other person who's important in their community. And as a part of that, we're often dealing with large sibling groups, and we're trying to keep them together if at all possible. And so that comes in paper. We review it in paper. What's there is available then for all the parties and lawyers. And we make a decision on that day to try and keep that child in the least restrictive placement possible for the immediate. The other way that a case would start would be the filing of a petition without a removal. So the child or children are remaining with their parent or parents or the home when they're in, and then we would see that family. The parents would come in, and we would have probably a pretrial conference. They'd remain with their parents at that time. We would have the opportunity to meet with them and their attorneys in court, and parties can make motions to remove at that point, and later to modify placement. So then parents, families are entitled to a hearing within 10 days of an ex parte removal. We have that court hearing. We can change placement or placements on that day. Children can go back to their parents on that day. Imminent harm is what we're considering of whether or not that's met. Approximately 30 days later, we have an important legal hearing, the adjudication hearing, determine whether their child or children are in need of assistance and they require the court's aid. We have certain statutory guidelines that guide us in that decision. And again, we're potentially making placement decisions at that point to keep the children together, to keep them with family, to keep them in the least restrictive placement possible. At disposition, we're in the 60 to 90 day time frame generally per federal regulations. The department at that point in time should have done quite a bit of work with the family. They have a lot to do. They have a lot of reporting they have to do. And they're providing us with information on relatives. There might be relatives out of state that we're considering. And then we're hopefully working towards, in almost every case, reunification with the home from which the child or children have been removed. So we are implementing services, requiring services to try and keep the children together, to try and get them back to the home from which they were removed, and endeavoring to do that in a setting that will allow for that. If necessary, we consider foster care placements certainly at all points in time. If there's not a less restrictive placement, we would consider foster care in the priority scheme down the list. If not, it's certainly less restrictive than group care. It's less restrictive than shelter care, but it is more restrictive than a relative placement or when viewing something through a child's eyes, what may be more home-like, more familiar to them, which lets them stay in their home school, lets them stay in their community, lets them be comfortable and well cared for. We then have, depending upon the age of the children, at this dispositional hearing, we're making placement decisions along with service decisions. We're finding whether it's contrary to the welfare of the children to remain outside the care of their parents, and we will schedule a review hearing. The child is under the age of 4. We typically, federal law is that we set a permanency hearing within a 6-month window. I would say that that doesn't happen in every case because sometimes we go with a 1-year window for that because of sibling groups. If we have a 2-year-old and a 6-year-old and a 7-year-old, it's hard to treat the 2-year-old differently from the older children. And so we're making placement decisions along those lines. Best practices require that we review the cases within 6 months. Many of us review these cases much more frequently, especially in the beginning of a child welfare case. Reviewing it every 2 or 3 months would be much more standard and in line with best practices. A lot of the things that we've done in child welfare around the concept of recovery court has parents and families reviewing those things well in advance of 2 months or 3 months. Sometimes in recovery court, they're being seen by the court on a weekly basis. Turning now to permanency, that is required to be within a year. And there are multiple options that you can pursue at permanency. One includes a 6-month extension of time for the parents to continue to work for reunification. We may be making decisions to direct the filing of a termination of parental rights at that point in time and plan for an adoption of the child or children by relatives or in foster care. and then federal guidelines require that we make permanency decisions within 18 months of when the children were removed from the home as a baseline matter. If children move back and forth between their parents and relative care or foster care, one of the important timelines that we consider is whether they've been out of home placement for 15 of the last 22 months. And if they have, then we make decisions that hopefully provide for what is permanency. And so that kind of talks about child care placement. A couple of things that I thought this group might find important are, my sense is that we have, in the time that I've been doing the work, and my belief over the last 15 years plus, we have greatly moved more towards relatives. We have moved more towards considering non-custodial parents, oftentimes fathers, as placement options for children. We do a lot of work trying to locate relatives in out-of-state through the interstate compact process if they're not able to be returned to their parents so that they can remain with their biological family. Those are things that the court does have involvement in. When it comes to placement, a judge typically makes a determination of the level of care, and we're required to try and keep children in the least restrictive placement possible. So if I place a child in foster care, I place the child in DHS custody and eventually guardianship for purposes of family foster care. I don't pick the foster home. If I learn of abuse in a foster home, I do have the ability, in my opinion, under court to say, not that home. And if they can't be placed in a less restrictive home, then I would still put them in DHS custody for foster care or for placement commensurate with their needs, so that there would be options for daily considerations, which sometimes there are, whether that's shelter, whether that's group care, or whether that's a relative or a parent, whatever the circumstances may be. And then I'd also thought it might be worth meriting mention, kind of limitations on judges. When we send a child and they might need a higher level of care, like a psychiatric institution, which we refer to as a PMIC, or a group care facility, we don't pick which one. We say DHS custody for placement in a residential group care facility. We might say such as one that we think matches up from an acuity-based perspective with the child's psychiatric and behavioral needs. But we don't typically pick a particular facility, and we're limited in those ways. So those were the only opening comments that I thought might be pertinent in explaining the judicial role in child care placement. And if you have questions, I'm happy to try and answer them as best I can on a non-case specific related basis.
Well, we really appreciate that. Chair recognizes Representative Wolf.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Judge Witt. So when you're approached for a ex parte removal order, who generally is in the room?
Typically, the county attorney is in the room. They have, in Polk County, they have investigators that do a lot of work. They work with the department, and oftentimes they are in the room. I have a preference that, similar as a judge when you read a search warrant, that I just read what's there and that I consider the information that's in writing. I would say that there are times, though, that there is back and forth conversation about placement and a consideration of placement.
Okay, thank you. And I ask because I've seen a lot of affidavits attached to the application for an emergency ex parte removal that seem real devoid of any kind of details. But you're saying generally, at least that's what you go by. You don't hear a lot of extras. Okay. So in your experience then, child's removed. Let me ask this. Do you put in your order, like placed with relatives, or do you just leave that up to DHS?
I place with relatives far more than I place in foster care. And oftentimes that's a result of good work by the Department of Human Services and the county attorney in searching for those persons and talking to these families and trying to determine who can help. And so oftentimes the specific name of the grandmother, aunt, uncle, or whomever it may be that will allow the child to be in the least restrictive placement possible is there. There are times, too, where the parents actually move out of the home and the relatives move in so that the kids can stay in their home and be familiar in their setting and be cared for by persons who are safe and can meet their needs on a daily basis.
Thank you. And we're talking about the ex parte removal order. Okay. Is it your experience then when the 10 days go by and the parents show up for the hearing on the ex parte removal, at that point, do they have counsel?
Absolutely. In our county, every case, we appoint, if we know who the parent is, as long as it's not an unidentified father or someone else, we administratively appoint and assume indigency at the time of appointment. And I think that's in line with best practices nationally, and I believe that we have done that in Polk County as long as I'm familiar with, and I believe probably dating back to Judge Cohen in particular, I would cite in Iowa Children's Justice work a decade or more ago.
I think that is a good idea, and I wish that was done across Iowa. If you have an opinion, at the time of the hearing, have the parents generally had the opportunity to talk to their court-appointed hearing more than 5 minutes before the hearing in the hall?
I would say that practice varies widely, and that varies on sometimes the quality of representation and the need to make certain that we have lawyers representing parents who are qualified and who have a heart and a passion for juvenile court work and for representing indigent persons. Also, though, some lawyers who are excellent lawyers are not able to connect due to sometimes the difficult circumstances that the parents are in. They may we may have a mother who has sought shelter in a domestic violence unit. We may have parents who are actively using and are homeless. We may have persons who are incarcerated that we're addressing as well. So I don't want to just say that it's that. I would say every year we get a little bit better at parents being well represented and having met their attorneys and being prepared in advance of even the 10-day hearings.
Do you have an opinion on how many of those ex parte removal hearings are uncontested? Would it be fair to say probably the vast majority of them?
I wouldn't say the vast majority. I would say the majority, though.
And when it's a dispositional hearing, you have the case plan. Do you get the case plan in advance of the dispositional hearing?
Yeah, we require the department, and we do a pretty good job with some exceptions of requiring that to be filed electronically 7 days in advance. And I make it my practice to do everything possible to read case plans before hearings and be prepared before hearings and to go in prepared to ask questions and to consider what is the appropriate placement today, whether children can be safe and go home with their parents that day, and that would be true at disposition, that would be true at review hearings or permanency hearings as well. There are exceptions where the department files reports late, but it is rare that I'm reading a report during a hearing or learning about that for the first time during a hearing.
One more question. I heard somebody say, and to be honest, I don't remember if it was someone from DHS or one of the assistant county attorneys. I believe I heard them say that, again, it's very rare that the parent or the child even go into the courtroom or get the opportunity to testify. And I think that's a problem. Are there a lot of kind of stipulated situations where the lawyers meet outside of the courtroom and then the parents are kind of informed, well, this is how it's going to go? Or do you have actual hearings for every review hearing, every removal hearing where the people come in and at least get the opportunity to speak if they want to speak?
I have actual hearings for every hearing. Nothing happens in chambers. Parents are in the courtroom. Children are invited. I would prefer children be in the courtroom more. That is an area that continually needs review and improvement in terms of meeting with children and making sure their voices are heard and that they're present when things are happening and being said about them and decisions are being made. But it is very rare that we would have any type of proceeding I can speak for Polk County and the 6 courtrooms that we're doing something without the parents in the room, or we're doing something without having at least an in-person hearing. We may not report every hearing with a court reporter, but they're brought into the courtroom, and I make it a practice, and I think it's important to give parents an opportunity to speak and to make sure they're clear on what they understand, and I think that comports with what's called procedural justice and other concepts.
I forgot one more question. There was testimony that China proceedings, dispositional hearings, adjudications, et cetera, are open to the public. There's a code section that says they're open unless a party requests they be closed or a judge sua sponte closes them. In my district, I'm not aware that there's ever been a China hearing open to the public. Is it pretty common in Polk County that contested adjudications or dispositional hearings are open to the public, which I assume would also include press, right?
Yes, that's correct. And the way I would address that is we do take the confidentiality concerns of the family and the fact that juvenile court records themselves under 232-147 are confidential, but that the hearings themselves are open to the public. So we post outside of our doors a hearing schedule for the day, and we list the initials of the children who are before us, and we don't actively do anything to close the hearing. We also don't actively do anything to say, hey, this child who's 3 years old or 16 years old is having a hearing due to allegations of abuse or neglect today. But unless we are asked or unless we are made aware that there are reasons to close a hearing, it is open to the public. And many family members, many service providers, those who are interested generally, and that may or may not include the press, can walk into our courtrooms.
Just to follow up on that then. So in a case that's getting a lot of publicity, you can't look it up online. You can't go online and try and find the docket and when there are hearings. So would it be, how would the press or the public find out when the hearings on a specific China case are taking place other than to check the daily calendar that's posted on the door of the courtroom?
That's a valid question, and I don't know that there's a good answer for that. And
Chair recognizes Senator Peterson.
Thanks for being here. So this is an area I need to learn more about. What is the role of the child, and how do you determine if the child or the child's guardian ad litem is part of the process?
we appoint a guardian ad litem for every case, and typically we will initially appoint a person designated as their attorney and guardian ad litem both. What case law tells us over the last 9 years, and I think it's been an excellent change, is that we bifurcate that role with frequency for children 10 years old and older, whose opinions themselves as to what they want may differ from that of the guardian ad litem. And we have 3 primary entities in Polk County that serve in this capacity: the Juvenile Public Defender's Office, the Youth Law Center, and Drake Legal Clinic. And in particular, Drake Legal Clinic frequently files written reports at every hearing and tells us exactly how many times they've met with the child, tells us who else they're talking to, their school, other social workers, other service providers, and so I know how many times they've seen the child. We have a stated preference that children be invited and allowed to come to court. I think that to carry that out requires a lot of work by guardian ad litems, seeing their children, knowing about their placement or placements, talking to the families, and we can continue to do a better job of actually having the children in the courtroom and having them have a voice and have a chance to speak, even if they're not called as a witness. And so, does that answer your question?
It does. And then So clearly, these are situations that are very difficult. Does the child ever get an opportunity to speak without the parents present to the judge?
Yes. The guardian ad litem and/or the child's attorney, or sometimes both, will oftentimes ask for what's called an in-camera hearing. And I hold those with some degree of frequency, and they are available. We used to hold those in the chambers adjacent to our courtrooms. We have a new facility in Polk County. We have certain conference rooms that we utilize for that purpose, and children are allowed to share with us without their parents present, without their foster care parents present. Oftentimes, a person called a CASA, court-appointed special advocate, may be present, or who I typically, especially if the child is 10 years or older, I let them decide who's in the room with them. And if they don't want their guardian ad litem and they only want their attorney, I would defer to them and want to hear from them directly. In a safe, small setting, a court reporter takes it down, but what I tell them is that it's confidential. It's unlikely that anyone's going to review what they say. It's possible that, in particular, the Court of Appeals, I can't speak for them, they might say that that has to be disclosed. So that's why I use a court reporter and report it, so that it's available there if anyone would ask what a child would say to me. But I don't make that available to the parents' attorneys or others.
And then one question that comes up sometimes from my constituents is what information from DHS in their reports that you receive does a parent and does a child have access to review? 100% of the information, or are there things that they don't get access to? And how are they notified about their hearings? Because I've also heard sometimes them say, I didn't even know there was a hearing. And so I guess I'd like an answer to both those questions.
A parent reviewing a case that's an active child welfare matter would have access to everything as a default matter, so in the normal course of things. And same would be true of a child. I know of, that might be coming through their guardian ad litem or through their attorney, but they should, as a general matter, have access. They have the right through the electronic docket management system to become a filer, to receive notifications of hearings, notifications of court rulings and orders via email directly into their email, just as lawyers do. Many parents' attorneys advocate for parents to be able to sign up in that manner. Now, I'm not a user of the system, and so I don't want to say that I know for certain that there aren't perhaps gaps that we can work on. For example, with exhibits and what the DHS reports are, it is my belief that for the most part, parents access that through their attorneys, parents access that themselves directly. Now, we are dealing with a lot of indigent and impoverished parents that maybe don't have home computers that are needing to do that through the public library system, and we are needing to do things in paper. In terms of notice of hearings, we have to continually try and make certain that we're clear and that we get those notices out. But for the most part, I think we do a pretty good job, and there are not things as a general matter that they are excluded from. There are exceptions though. So if you are a father and there are 4 children and you're the father of 1, you're not going to have access to any of the files in the other 3 children's cases. And there might be reports that get filed somehow in those other cases because your interest is in your child, not in the family as a whole. And there might be confidential documents, for example, a psychological evaluation or a health report on the mother, that there may be good reason not to share that with a father of a child. And so there are exceptions, but that would be the exception and not the rule.
Thank you. Senator Sinclair.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you very much, Judge Witt, for being with us today. You mentioned several times out of state placements. You spoke about those a couple of different times as being least restrictive. Are there instances where those out-of-state placements with family are not least restrictive, that you would place them locally with a foster family?
Yeah, you ask a fair question, and I would agree. So, for example, a lot of that would depend on the timing. And so the answer to your question is yes, and where an out-of-state placement, the timing of it may matter a lot, and it may not be the least restrictive placement at a given time. In particular, in the first 6, 12, or 18 months of a child welfare case, we would be often reticent to use an out-of-state placement because we're trying to reunify with the home from which the child was removed. So to send a child to Texas or North Carolina when the parent is here and we're actively trying to reunify, we can't do that. And so if there aren't any local relatives, then we very well may use foster care during that time and hope and be clear that we're trying to reunify, and that if we're not able to, the concurrent plan may be the grandmother or the aunt and uncle who live in another state. But we might start that process for a review through the Interstate Compact process to get the home study done of that home to make sure that get the best information on the ground we can that they're an approved home in that other state. So I typically don't really consider placing a child out of state until I feel strongly that we're not going to be able to reunify with the family. And so it would typically be at the 1-year mark, sometimes a little sooner, depending upon the age of the child and the needs of the children.
And I appreciate that very much, because that was my major concern, was if our ultimate goal is to reunify a family, how do we do that if we take them 1,000 miles away at another state?
Absolutely. So
Appreciate
I
that.
would say it would be extremely rare, for instance, at the time of disposition for a child to be placed out of state.
Thank you.
Chair recognizes Representative Heaton. And just for the full discourse, we have about 5 minutes before our next presenter.
Okay. You mentioned guardian ad litem, and I've heard several compliments today on your work. And you say that you're assured that each guardian ad litem that is assigned to a child is making at least a contact with that child, at least on an annual basis or more.
Absolutely. I mean,
you know that for sure.
well, it's hard for me to answer that question for a couple of reasons. Typically, most of my cases finish within 18 months. That's what the federal guidelines require, and I am aware and I endeavor to ask, when's the last time you saw the child? How are they doing? Why aren't they here at court today? All of those things in that 18-month window. I have other children on my docket that I care very much about whose cases remain open for longer periods of time, oftentimes because they're in group care placements. And I do believe, for example, that social workers are required to see those children once a month under federal law. And so social workers are seeing those children. Statewide and even in my county, could guardian ad litems do a better job of seeing those children on a more frequent basis when they have an open child welfare case? Absolutely. We need to do a better job with that. And the way in which that's done is we need to have caseload restrictions on those persons, and we need to have persons only who are experts in child welfare assigned to be those persons. I believe national standards, National Association of Child's Counsel, and others would tell you that no more than 80 children should be on a guardian ad litem's docket. I can tell you in Polk County, there are many that we have at least double that, probably more. And so for them to go and see their children with any degree of frequency, yeah, we could do a better job in that area. But to say that a child is being seen by a guardian ad litem annually, I do believe that's true in Polk County as a majority for open child welfare cases. Now, once we've achieved permanency, and if we transfer to probate court for guardianship, or if there's a termination in adoption, the guardian ad litem is not seeing the children, and the court involvement is over. So they are not seeing those children.
Thank you. Sometimes I go to foster care meetings where they're gathered, all the foster care people in a certain area, and they get together and talk. And I always ask them, how many of you senior ad litem here within a year? And I remember one time I had 100 foster parents in a room, and I had 3 that had seen a guardian ad litem.
Yep.
So I know that's inconsistent across the state, and I compliment you. One last question. Could you explain to me a little more the importance of a court-appointed special advocate, CASA, and the role that they play in this process? Because I haven't talked about today.
Yeah. I don't know what percentage of my cases I appoint a CASA in, but a CASA is part of, what you're referencing, I'm assuming, is probably the Foster Care Review Board, and CASA is another arm of that, which I think is housed in the Department of Inspections and Appeals. But a CASA is a concerned, caring person who receives training, who gets one case at a time, and that's all they have is one family or one child, and then they provide a hopefully unbiased perspective on what the child needs on that day, at that time, the current needs, and opinions and recommendations as to what the family's strengths are, what some of the shortcomings are that may prevent reunification, and what recommendations there are from the court. And so I'm not able to appoint a CASA in every case, but in cases in which I think the end of the road is uncertain, or we're going to experience troubles with placement, or there's a lot of risk or potential for bias in a particular case due to the level of consternation and difficulty at the beginning because of that, I'll appoint a CASA to hopefully provide me with a unfiltered, unbiased set of eyes to really tell me what's going on. Are these kids really in danger? Can they go home? When can they go home? And if they shouldn't go home, where should they go that they're going to be safe, unconditionally loved and cared for by committed people who are doing it for the right reasons? And so I'm not able to use CASA every time, but I do think they're an important, and they're volunteers, and so they got no skin in the game. We have a lot of retired people, for instance, who have a lot to give and who do a lot in that area.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Judge. We certainly appreciate your time. And if we have any further questions, we'll let you know.
Great.
For the attention of the committee and the members of the room, we've asked that the temperature be turned down a little bit, so hopefully we can get it a little bit cooler in here. Moving right along with our agenda, we still have 4 more items on our agenda. Next up, the committee would like to hear from Abby Patterson. She is the Child Abuse Prevention Program Coordinator with Prevent Child Abuse Iowa. So Abby, welcome, and thank you for coming.
Thank you. Like you said, my name is Abby Patterson with Prevent Child Abuse Iowa. Since 1982, Prevent Child Abuse Iowa has served as the program administrator for the Iowa Child Abuse Prevention Program. It's a program that was set up in Iowa Code specifically for prevention and not child welfare or treatment services. A couple of the items within Iowa Code: the program must be applied for and received by volunteer community coalitions. It's intended to be a very community-based program. And the program is overseen by an independent review committee. The coalitions themselves vary from county to county. Most of them are very grassroots. The project is intended to be set up to be multidisciplinary. A few of the coalitions have staff that they employ to provide services, but most of them subcontract services, and it's really volunteer in nature. The coalitions are intended to be broadly representative of the community and the leader of child abuse prevention in their communities. These community groups are to an extent in every county. The ICAP program, along with CBCAP, and I'll explain the difference, I guess, there in a little bit. They're currently funding projects in all but 6 of Iowa counties. Some of the projects are very small, but they The efforts have historically, as far as prevention efforts, been categorized into 3 different types of prevention: primary prevention, secondary prevention, and tertiary prevention. Primary prevention is considered to be efforts directed at everybody. So parenting class that's open to the public. Secondary services are intended to be targeted to at-risk families, families that have known risk factors for abuse. And then tertiary prevention is trying to prevent re-abuse after we've already got an open case. ICAP funds mostly secondary prevention, but some primary prevention. So we don't fund projects that work with system-involved families. The program has an emphasis on using evidence-based curricula and models, so interventions that have been proven to reduce the risk of abuse. We know that when we direct our efforts towards the most high-risk, vulnerable families, we see the most results. And we really work on reducing those risk factors and promoting protective factors, where we see we do evaluations with the projects and look at those protective factors. So things like parenting knowledge, having access to concrete supports, nurturing and attachment, positive social support, and parental resilience. So when we build those up, we reduce risk of abuse in families. And when we think about how that works, if we have a parent and they have better understanding of age-appropriate expectations for their children, we're less likely to see them becoming frustrated with challenging behaviors or, children's limitations. Also, we find parent stress is less when they have access to the concrete resources that they need to be good parents. So the funding for this program is made up of several different funding streams. And when I say ICAP and CBCAP, I'm talking about the Iowa Child Abuse Prevention Program, and the CBCAP is Community-Based Child Abuse Prevention Program. CBCAP is a federal funding that has historically been separate from the ICAP program. ICAP is funded by promoting safe and stable families, temporary assistance for needy families, a little bit of CAPTA, Child Abuse Prevention Treatment Act money, and then there is some state funding in the ICAP program as well. There's about $215,000 from birth certificate fees, and there's about $200,000 appropriation specifically for sexual abuse prevention. And then there's also some funds that are donated through the income tax checkoff. Like I said, historically, CBCAP and ICAP have been separate. Those programs will be merging. There's a lot of duplication and overlap. And so in order to reduce some redundancies and have some administrative savings, those programs will be merging. So if there's some information that's provided that'll have both programs going forward after July 1st. Those are combining. So what does this look like in communities? With those two funding streams, there's currently 144 contracts to provide services in 93 counties. That's from fiscal year 2016 to 2018. The projects there's an RFP process and a competitive bid process for those funds. Things like parent development, so parent education, home visiting, evidence-based home visitation, sexual abuse prevention, crisis and respite care, community-based family team meetings. We've got one small project there, and then a little bit of funding in community development. We know that even if we outlaw spanking, if the community doesn't feel like that's the right thing and every parent feels like spanking is the best way to parent, we're not going to change behavior. So we talk about policy change, but we also talk about community climate and attitude change as well. Like I said, those grants are awarded through an extensive and independent competitive process. So a couple of examples of what that might look like. We receive kind of stories about how does this money impact families. So we received a story about a 15-year-old new mom, Kaden. She had a lot of risk factors, obviously her young age being one of them, but also a lack of resources. She had a troubled past, didn't have a good relationship with her own parents, just had a lack of resources. And she became connected with a young parents group, so there were other young parents for her to receive some social support as well as information about good parenting practices. That project, or that story, came from Woodbury County. Lynn County also has a good example of a respite care program that was able to provide services to a single mom who had an accidental injury and needed to have medical treatment. She didn't have a safe place for her children to go to while she, took care of herself and met her own medical needs. So the respite care services allowed a safe place for her child to go, for her to take care of herself. The program provides services to over 3,000 families every year, approximately 56,000 hours of respite care. The ICAP program serves almost 350 families in home visitation. They provide sexual abuse prevention education to 33,000 children and over 5,000 adults. And the CBCAP program is a little bit smaller. They have 31 parent development projects that serve almost 1,500 families, and crisis care services that are 16,000 hours per year. Like I said, these services are available depending on county. They do vary from county to county, but are available, and there's community groups working on these issues in all but 6 counties. So when we look at the demographic of people that receive services, our ICAP participants are a lot less likely to be homeowners. They have more economic struggles or have higher rates of being low income. Roughly half receive Medicaid benefits. 36% report being told at one point that they have a mental illness. A quarter of them were abused themselves as children as far as the parents. And 76% of them have a household income under $38,000 per year. And so a lot of the services are open to everybody, but there is an effort to target those that may be most at risk or have a lack of social supports or a lack of access to concrete resources. In talking about abuse and how that relates to the bigger picture of our state as far as health and social well-being, I wanted to touch briefly on the Adverse Childhood Experiences research. Adverse Childhood Experiences, or ACEs, have been studied both at the national level and at the state level. So there's 5 different types of abuse or neglect that's studied in those studies: physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, physical neglect, and emotional neglect, as well as caretaker substance abuse, caregiver mental illness, divorce or parental separation, family member being incarcerated, or domestic violence. And in those studies, both the national study and the Iowa research shows that for every different category that a child has experienced, there's a dose-response relationship in that the more they've experienced, so whether it's 1 category or 10 categories, the more you've experienced, the higher your risk of developing health and social problems later in life. And so those health and social problems could be things like depression. If you've experienced 4 or more ACEs, compared to somebody who never experienced those issues, you're 6 times more likely to have depression. You're over 4 times more likely to develop COPD. So not only is bad things happening to kids in just not good, we can all agree, but it's very costly when we talk about economic long-term effects of negative things happening to children. So people in Iowa with high ACE scores do tend to be younger. They tend to be multiracial or African American. They tend to have less academic achievements or less likely to have a high school diploma. I would encourage you, if you're not familiar with this research, to look that up. The IDPH, or Iowa Department of Public Health, collects this information through the BRFAS study, but it is available. If you'd like to have access to that, I can get that for you. Along with, depression and COPD, certain types of cancer, being a smoker, having unintended pregnancies, workplace problems, the effects of ACEs is really, really significant. And it's costly to our society. So talking about prevention, preventing adverse things happening to children, we believe that prevention is an investment to have an increased ability to intervene with families before there's a crisis or DHS involvement. We know that there are evidence-based programs and practices that can reduce the likelihood of negative things happening to children and promote protective factors in families. Within the continuum of prevention and care, there's a lot of focus on treatment. There's a lot of money that goes to treatment, not as much on prevention, but certain studies have shown that there is really a positive long-term good return on investment with many of these evidence-based practices. We would urge decision makers to always keep prevention in mind anytime that decisions are being made about funding treatment programs, that we think about prevention as well.
Thank you for your presentation. Chair recognizes Representative Heaton and then Senator Peterson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So you talked about merging these two entities. Mm-hmm. And my question is, who made that decision?
That was a decision made by the Department of Human Services. There was also information collected from the recipients of both of those grant dollars, as well as community groups.
And my money too, our money too, the state. We contribute to you, community partnerships.
The community partnerships,
I call it community partnerships, you call it something else, but you're bringing these two groups together.
There's a specific, the CBCAP funds that goes to the community partnership sites, that is a federal funding stream specifically for child abuse prevention.
I know, but I also contribute to community partnerships also.
Yes, okay, oh, I won't disagree with you there, but you're asking.
The point I'm getting at is, I want to know what would be your relationship with Early Childhood Iowa and the work that they're doing in prevention, in home visiting, in parenting, and all the other things that you said. It looks like we have some duplication here. Or are you working together?
We work really closely with Early Childhood Iowa. A lot of our programs are dual funded. Early Childhood Iowa has a number of outcomes that they're looking at as far as great outcomes for children. They look at health, they do look at abuse, family, economic self-sufficiency. I'm definitely not an expert on Early Childhood Iowa. We have a lot of priorities that are very much aligned. I will say that for this program, the number one goal is to prevent abuse and neglect in children, and not necessarily the other child
I know,
outcomes.
but when it comes to ACEs, I think everybody's interested in preventing those
Absolutely.
those adverse child experiences.
Mm-hmm.
Makes a big difference. Well, thank you. That's all the questions I have.
Chair recognizes Senator Peterson.
Do you have data on how Iowa stacks up to other states in terms of the amount of money that we put in toward parent coaching type of program, like home visitation, child abuse prevention, things that we do to support parents in the prevention efforts, like compared to how other states, I know like Minnesota has amazing parenting university programs all over for people of all income brackets. I'm just wondering how we stack up.
That information I don't have at my fingertips, but I'd be happy to look into that and provide you with whatever resources I'm able to find.
Thank you. Is there any other questions? Well, thank you very much for your time. We certainly appreciate it.
Thank you.
I see the sheriff has walked in, so I guess we'll move along. We're running a little ahead of schedule, which is a good thing. For the 2 o'clock time slot, we were looking for law enforcement process review. And so we have with us Sheriff Steve Hoffman with Marshall County. And is the police chief here yet? Yeah, there's the police chief. Jeff Hansen is the police chief with the Spirit Lake Police Department. We appreciate both of your time and being here. We wanted a law enforcement perspective. So feel free to give us any information that you think that we should know. And if you'd be okay with taking a couple of questions, we've got about 35 minutes slotted for you.
Very good. I am Steve Hoffman, Marshall County Sheriff, and I'm pleased to be in front of this committee here today under unfortunate circumstances, albeit, but I'm happy to take this time and explain how law enforcement process work with Department of Human Services and specifically my office and from what I'm aware of with that of my colleagues. What I would share with you with the intake process with Department of Human Services when I or my deputies encounter situations where we believe a child may be in danger, similar to any other mandatory reporter, we would take action to report through centralized intake with the Department of Human Services. During business hours, centralized intake will make the determination if that case will be accepted or rejected. I would share that law enforcement in contrast to some other mandatory reporters, we do have the authority to remove children in danger. So if we believe that a child is in a dangerous circumstance, we can do emergency removal of children. After hours process, we would contact again that same centralized reporting intake service. However, the process changes somewhat in the after hours, as at least in our service area. The on-call investigators are contacted by the hub that answers those intake calls. And after hours, we receive callbacks from investigators in our service area that we would otherwise routinely work with. And from there, we will typically develop an investigative strategy if it's a combined investigation. As you might imagine, some of the calls for service that we respond to, some are familiar in nature and not necessarily criminal in nature for those in need of particular family services. And obviously we could have those that have children with injury or the propensity for injury or sexual assault, which would require a combined investigative effort. And I would also share with you that in my experience in our service area, particularly with sexual assault or children that have received serious injury, we have a great effort at collaboration and running combined investigations. There was a time period where I would say that it was not you had the left hand not necessarily know what the right hand was doing, and by that DHS in their diligence was jumpstarting an investigation. However, that could have an effect on the criminal investigation, as you might imagine, where DHS investigators have already began speaking with a potential suspect, and then law enforcement enters the investigation at a time to now re-interview. So we try to run those investigations more simultaneous at a joint response for the best outcome, obviously for the child and for the public at large and the agencies.
My name is Jeff Hansen. I'm the Chief of Police in Spirit Lake, Northwest Iowa. And We work very well and closely with our DHS partners up in our county. They do a very good job. As far as the centralized intake goes, we'd contact the intake, and there'd be at times, I guess, we become a little frustrated with the intake just because they may deny a case. And I can think of several instances that, as law enforcement, we pursued investigating that case and actually resulted in charges. And then we would contact the intake back and advise them of this, and then they would open up a case on it. I've been up there for 30 years, and when we used to work locally with our local DHS office, more times than not, they're familiar with maybe some of the families or people that we're dealing with and have a background on the circumstances. And, there was one particular case that we reached out to DHS and our county attorney's office, reference an incident after it was declined from the centralized intake. And between communicating between the three of us, we were able to get a case opened up and an investigation started. But as far as the centralized intake, we do run into some issues where cases are denied, and we continue on with them, and eventually they are opened.
Okay, who would like to ask Senator McCoy? Chair recognizes Senator McCoy.
Thank you, gentlemen. Just really one question, and that is, do you find that when you do a centralized intake, if the individual or the juvenile that you're calling about is older, they're treated differently than if they are a toddler or youngster, say under the age of 10? Because I've heard that from law enforcement. Can either of you comment, or do either of you wish to comment?
Senator, I'd share with you that in my experience, I have not experienced that.
We have not either experienced that.
Okay. Thank you.
Chair recognizes Representative Winchell and then Wolf.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, gentlemen, for what you do. Chief, when you've had these denials or these rejections from DHS, are they giving you a rationale or a reason behind it?
Yeah, one of the incidents was that a 16-year-old female was being choked by her mother. Two adults came in, removed the mother from the daughter, contacted us. We contacted the intake, and they asked if there's any visible injuries. And obviously there wasn't. But with strangulation, you can have internal type injuries. And the reasoning at that point was that they denied it because there was no visible marks. We pursued with the investigation and through our county attorney's office and ended up with charges, and then eventually they did open up a case.
Okay.
Reference that.
Have you ever had an instance where you brought a case forward, they rejected it, and then nothing ever came of it? It never came to where you were able to pursue the investigation and the case was just closed?
Yes. And I mean, and on these several cases, if we went to pursue them ourselves, more than likely they would have just been denied and we would have went about our business.
Well, I guess that leads to another question, probably for DHS then, of why are they denying cases when it's coming from law enforcement and law enforcement is bringing it to them? But I suppose that's an answer we'll have to seek at another time. So again, gentlemen, thank you for what you do.
Chair recognizes Representative Wolf.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, gentlemen. Chief, so a lot of the situations that we've been hearing about going down where perhaps the DHS investigation into it has not resulted in any action, a lot of them seem to be criminal offenses. For example, choking someone. We often hear about assaults, physical beating or bruising. Regardless of what DHS does, certainly law enforcement has at least the option, to some extent the ability, to investigate allegations of criminal assaults without DHS involvement, correct?
Correct.
So So do you do that if you get a phone call and someone says this child is being physically abused and you report it to DHS and DHS doesn't do anything, or they're too busy, or they can, do you routinely then follow up with your own investigation to, I guess, check on what DHS did, or maybe as law enforcement you might have some options available to you that DHS wouldn't necessarily have? Or do you, in general, kind of, if DHS comes back with this is unfounded, do you just accept that and move on?
Depending on the circumstances, reference the case. But we work very well hand in hand with DHS, and I guess it's kind of a partnership as far as what their specific field of expertise is in our field. And, you know, on several of those cases, you know, I believe that they should have been open from the intake to get DHS involved from the get-go, other than waiting, but that's my opinion.
Representative Wolf, I may follow up also. As I mentioned earlier, these investigations are typically separate, independent, yet parallel. So regarding a response from DHS, that doesn't necessarily have bearing on the investigations, at least out of my office. What we would find from them, if we had probable cause to believe that a crime may be committed, we would continue that investigation along our track. We also have to keep in mind that a number of the types of incidents that get reported to us, specifically regarding children, may or may not involve a caretaker, which is, I'm sure you know or have discovered, that element of being a caretaker is a significant issue as far as Department of Human Services being involved. For our purposes in the criminal investigation, that doesn't matter. What matters is if there was a crime that was committed and following up and determining that. So as the investigation continues and or if we discover that there is a caretaker standard involved in that, that can bring Department of Human Services back into the fold. But I do want to make that clear that there's a distinction between the investigations that I mentioned before. When we begin our investigations, we try to coordinate them at the beginning time so it makes sense for the successful outcome, but they are in fact separate, distinct, and parallel.
Okay, thank you. I'm glad to hear that. So a little, it sounded like sometimes there was kind of a joint investigation as opposed to independent, and saying that it is independent. You don't necessarily just adopt the DHS report.
I think that's a fair characterization. Also, I think it's important to remember that we have different missions in our role in society, from the criminal justice aspect in contrast with Department of Human Services for the outcome that we're looking for. Ultimately, of course, we're both looking for the protection of the children, but beyond that, you know, we're looking to hold somebody accountable to our criminal justice system if a crime did occur. And I'm not familiar with the specific mission of DHS, but working with them for the better part of 30 years, I would say that it's important for them to for the protection of the children and also the family unit as a whole, and they're trying to create systems and circumstances to keep those children and family in functional units.
One more question. So sometimes when there's an allegation of drug use in front of the children, parents will be called down to DHS, and there's a request often for a hair sample from either the child or the adult. If you know, is it typical to have law enforcement present at that time?
Typically not for the times that parents are called to the office. We do routinely assist the investigators in our service area in home visits, particularly if they have any sense at all that it could be an otherwise dangerous environment. Having mentioned the children and drugs, I would have to say the only other degree of conflict with policy within our office and some of my colleagues across the state in recent years was the philosophy within DHS with marijuana use in the home not being considered a negative environment or something to that effect for the children as compared to other controlled substances. And for our drug and endangered children protocol, of course, we consider all illicit substances important in the family, and certainly want to keep the children safe in those environments.
So if a parent makes an admission of either using or possessing, say, marijuana, when you go into the home with DHS, is that then typically something that you would follow up with criminal charges, or no? Or is there a policy on that what's said basically in response to questions from DHS kind of targeted at ascertaining whether or not a child is at risk is not then used by law enforcement to press criminal charges against the parents?
Depending on the if the child's tested and drug levels determined in the child, that could make that case move forward in a criminal fashion. The admission of a parent to having had marijuana in the home or having to have used marijuana in the home, in my experience, would not make that a criminal case without further supporting evidence, whether that was followed up with a search warrant or additional corroborating evidence. Their admission alone without physical evidence or evidence that the child had contact or ingested the drugs would make that, I think, exceedingly difficult.
I promise, last question. Do you know if parents are advised that the results of these tests, hair tests, or whatever test is used to ascertain whether there are drugs in the child, are they advised that the results of that could be used against them in a criminal proceeding?
Representative Wolf, I'm not certain. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm not aware.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Chair recognizes Representative Thede.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, gentlemen, for coming today. And I'm very glad to hear that you're working with DHS, on investigations. But let me ask you a question, because I just don't know. Your investigation of the case would be different from their investigation. And I'm just asking. Yours would be more criminal, correct?
Correct.
And theirs would be more policy criteria kind of rules that were broken. So tell me how do you come together to formulate an effective investigation on both sides? Because I think I'm a little confused about how you do that.
If I may, one of the unfortunate, most frequent examples that we have of working with Department of Human Services is in sexual abuse allegations. So in those cases there, one of the first things that we want to do is protect the child and also make sure that they're not interviewed by somebody that is that is an inappropriate person for a child interview. So what we would do is we would arrange interview from a Child Protective Service with Department of Human Services, and that's again where I would say begins again a part of the joint yet separate and distinct investigation where we've been coordinating the safety. So when these interviews are taking place, depending on the results and the outcome, obviously the Department of Human Services is going to follow their protocol for the safety needs of the child. Typically before those interviews, Department of Human Services take the action that they need to do to make sure that the child is protected from the alleged offender prior to that interview. We take measures collaboratively to make sure that they be protected from being influenced by anybody that may be a suspect in that investigation. Following the physical examination and the oral interview, Department of Human Services investigators would then coordinate with our investigators for the suspect interview or interrogation, whichever is appropriate. And then obviously from there, depending on the physical evidence and admissions or denials, obviously the county attorney would be consulted at that point in time and would have bearing on where the criminal case would go, which is a separate threshold from where Department of Human Services is going to be with their needs assessment for that child and family.
Well, and so to follow that up, just to say that, so in your investigation, wherever it may lead you, it could go faster or slower than what's happening with DHS or the other way around. So how do you, I guess I'm trying to, so let's just say if you arrest someone for abuse, for physical abuse, he now goes to jail, now it gets investigated. So what happens during that time? And I guess with your investigation during that time? Or are you done once you have arrested that particular person?
In the example that you provided, you're talking about a child that's been potentially assaulted, an offender has been arrested, and then as far as the welfare of the child, then that would be a key role of Department of Human Services at that point in time after we have arrested the violator. They would, our emergency care provision would have been in place at the front end of that, where if we were going to do an emergency removal, there would be an imminent danger at that point in time. Obviously, if we've taken measures to arrest the offender and remove that, we wouldn't necessarily have grounds for an emergency removal at that point in time. So that's where our DHS investigators become a key component of that, to make sure the rest of the family dynamics are supporting a healthy and safe environment from that point, and the follow-up services.
Chair recognizes Senator Breitbach.
Thank you. Thank you, gentlemen, for being here. Are there specific things that you feel that should change either in enforcement policy or DHS policy to protect children? You know, maybe you have accompanied DHS, went to a home that you were supposed to investigate, but maybe no one answered the door. You had a feeling somebody was there, but you couldn't do anything about it. Do you ever get this feeling that you throw up your hands and say, well, I think we should do something, but, you know, we're just prevented from doing that? Is there something that you could see needing to be proactively done that would allow you to do a better job of protecting the entire state, protecting our children?
Well, I do think it's important that all of these allegations and suspicious reports of abuse are followed through. And I would say in our service area, we have a small but mighty group of investigators that are diligent in following up. So I can't say that I have an answer to that, but I do have a concern with the caseloads and the degree of intakes, and of course with the DHS policy, they're required to follow up on those allegations within 24 hours. And the reports obviously continue to come. So that's where my concern is, that items that could be overlooked through the funnel, as reports continue to come in, that those items, as you mentioned, where you're at the door and you don't get an answer, my concern is that that could be overlooked, and with the slew of oncoming information. And much like the pendulum that we are today, with where we're at today by tragedy, my concern with the intake center is where you may have some reports from around the state with concerns of cases that were rejected. My concern with the intake center now is that they take everything, and everything that's going to come to the service areas are still going to have to be investigated preliminarily within 24 hours. So the diligence that our investigators, I'm talking about Department of Human Services, the DHS investigators take with that 24-hour period, my concern is the degree of amount of time that they're going to be able to spend if their caseload on initial cases grows exponentially by, I guess I would say, lack of triage that could be happening at the intake level.
And I believe it's very important as far as for DHS to have enough investigators to follow through with these investigations and to do the follow-ups as well. I mean, because that will help in the protection of the children, possibly criminal charges, and successful prosecution of these people. And I guess I would urge you guys to also listen to the people that are actually doing the job, that are out there doing investigations that have the feet on the ground and allow them to be completely honest with you guys without any repercussions from administrators or policy or procedure makers on what works best and what doesn't work. You know, I think to give them the leeway to be honest and to help out in these situations.
You recognize Senator Peterson?
Thank you. I think maybe it was you that mentioned the term that caretaker was a big issue. Are you finding that the terminology we're using of caretaker is preventing you from really doing DHS doing their job, or you doing your job of seeking out abuse, because what we define as caretaker may not be where the abuse is happening, but abuse is happening?
I would say in our role, not necessarily. We certainly would welcome other services being available, because that's essentially what I look at as DHS is opening other services available to me. But if I would give you an example again of if we had a child and it was one of their relatives that didn't live with them that was sexually abusing them, that's not going to fall under the caretaker role. That's not going to change how our office does our investigation. It's not going to change how we put that family in contact with other community services and with child protective services with their interviews for follow-up mental health care and physical examination. We're still going to carry through in those roles.
And are you finding that DHS is referring, if it is a legal issue versus an abuse issue, that you are getting those calls from them? They're not just rejecting them, but they're doing the follow-up to make sure that your offices know something that would be criminal?
Chief?
I guess I didn't understand the question. So if it's
so
not...
it gets rejected from DHS because it's not abuse, but it is against the law. It is a crime.
As far as if, honestly, I'm not sure if we get those referrals from the intake center, if it does not fall underneath the DHS guidelines to be investigated. I don't know.
Okay, is there any other members of the committee that have questions for them? Well, thank you both for your time. We really appreciate having the law enforcement perspective, and we'll definitely be in touch if we need anything in the future. So thank you.
Thank you.
For the final part of our afternoon, before we move on to closing comments, we've invited Scott Woodruff. Scott is with the Homeschool Legal Defense Association and is here to give that perspective on homeschooling and answer questions. So Scott, thank you for being here today.
Thank you so much.
You press your button.
There we go, much better. Thank you, Chairman Kaufman. Thank you, Chairman Breitbach, distinguished members of the committee. I'm Scott Woodruff with Homeschool Legal Defense Association. My title there is Senior Counsel. That means I'm old. Last week I ran across a fascinating article in the Los Angeles Times quoting an earthquake expert, a seismologist named Lucy Jones. She was talking about the somewhat random timing of earthquakes and the public's desire for certainty. And she said, quote, "We have literally evolved to be afraid of randomness, so we respond by trying to find the pattern. We evolved to find these patterns to infer that waves in the grass mean a predator is hiding. We find patterns even when they are not real. We see constellations in the stars. When there is no pattern, we still try to make one." I'll come back to that. You have two very different but very important questions before you today. One, what went wrong in these cases? Two, how can we do better in the future? I have nothing to say about the first question, what went wrong. But to help you answer the second question, I'm handing each of you a complete copy of the final report of the Federal Commission to Eliminate Child Abuse and Neglect Fatalities. I'll just call it by its initials, CCANF. Have all the elected folks gotten one? Very good. The CCANF Commission was composed of top child abuse experts from around the country. The Commission held hearings across the nation for 2 years, gathering evidence and testimony to fulfill their congressional mandate, which was to come up with a comprehensive national strategy to reduce or eliminate child abuse deaths. Their final report was issued just last year. You don't need to reinvent the wheel. You can benefit from their 2 years of labor. I commend you in calling this hearing to answer what went wrong, but probably nothing you can do can compare with the truly national breadth, depth, and scope of what the CCANF report did in answering the question, how can we do better? You can read the executive summary yourself, but allow me to give you an executive summary of the executive summary. And it goes like this. You can save lives by developing a policy firmly grounded in statistically valid risk factors. The number one risk factor that overshadows them all is that a family under current investigation has a prior report of abuse or neglect. After a shocking spike in child deaths, Wichita, Kansas took statistically valid data, zip codes where child deaths were most frequent, and crafted a strategy that resulted in a dramatic reduction in deaths. The CCANF report that you're now looking at dedicates an entire chapter to the success in Wichita. Hillsborough County, Florida, started with statistically valid data after they had a horrific spike in deaths. They started with families already in their system. They combed through those files, found the families who needed extra attention and help. They developed strategies that produced a breathtaking reduction in child deaths. The CCANF report before you dedicates an entire chapter to the Hillsborough success. What do Hillsborough and Wichita have in common? They did not pick a few dramatic, horrific cases and build their strategy down from there. They started with verifiable, statistically valid data and built their strategy up from the verified data. What else do they have in common? A proven track record of success. They succeeded where many have failed, and that got the attention of CCANF. As if to prove CCANF correct, the Sabrina Ray and Natalie Finn cases, so sad, so unfortunate, that we came here to discuss today fit squarely within CCANF's number one recommendation. They both involved families with at least one prior report to social services. Not to rub salt into the wound, but Natalie and Sabrina might be alive today if Iowa had followed only CCANF's number one recommendation. Let me quickly mention that CCANF does not identify homeschooling as a risk factor for child abuse. Neither does the Mayo Clinic. Neither has the Iowa Child Death Review Team in any of its published reports ever cited homeschooling as a risk factor. There's no reason to question the objectivity of those reports. As a point of reference, about 350 children die annually in Iowa from all causes. I'd like to interrupt here and respond to some testimony earlier where someone said that when we bring a child to truancy court and they say, we're going to homeschool, that everything stops and we can't do anything. And speaking to you as a lawyer who's been on prosecution and defense, that's just not accurate. If a child and his parents have committed the predicate acts for truancy, those predicate acts are there even if the parents subsequently decide to homeschool. Deciding to homeschool doesn't change the facts if the child has violated the law. Just like if you get the blue lights flash behind you for going 45 in a 25 zone today, and then tomorrow you go 25 the whole way, that doesn't wipe out your ticket. You've already broken the law. Same thing with truancy. If a child has committed the predicate acts of truancy, those don't get wiped out because they simply decide to homeschool. Those can be prosecuted just as ever. The judge has discretion in how to treat those. The judge, if the person's found guilty of truancy while attending the public school, the judge could possibly forbid them from homeschooling or allow them to homeschool only under certain conditions that he finds acceptable. So, a lot of options are still available. Let me transition here and quickly respond to a few suggestions floating around the legislature that more regulations to homeschool families should be added in response to the criminal acts of a tiny handful of people. First, let me offer a definition of a successful policy, one for which there is credible evidence that it works. There is a suggestion that all homeschooled children be tested annually. A little over 20 states require mandatory testing for homeschooled students. Those include South Dakota, Maine, New York, and others. But there is no credible evidence that homeschooled children in those states do any better than in the majority of states where testing is not required. Mandatory testing cannot be considered a successful policy. There is a suggestion that homeschool parents should be required to notify the public schools. Homeschool parents in a number of states, including Ohio, Wisconsin, West Virginia, are required to notify an official. But there is no credible evidence that homeschooled children in those states benefit in any way from the required notice. Mandatory notice cannot be considered a successful policy. There is a suggestion that homeschooled children be required to be seen periodically by a mandatory child abuse reporter, doctor, nurse, public school teacher, etc. Pennsylvania requires homeschoolers every year or periodically to receive dental and medical exams, hearing tests, vision tests, height and weight measurements, and even a tuberculosis test, all of which would require contact with a mandatory child abuse reporter. There is no credible evidence that homeschooled children in Pennsylvania benefit in any way from those requirements. Those mandates cannot be considered a successful policy. And in the cases that we're talking about here today, those young people actually had contact with mandatory reporters. There's a suggestion that parents should have at least a high school diploma before being allowed to homeschool their children. In 41 states, including Missouri, Minnesota, and Illinois, parents with no high school diploma can homeschool their children. There is no credible evidence that children in the other 9 states benefit from restricting homeschooling based on the education of their parents. Educational restrictions on parents cannot be considered a successful policy. There's a suggestion that the 2013 reforms to the homeschool law somehow allowed these tragic cases, supposedly because the former law required all homeschooled kids to have contact with a mandatory reporter. That is simply incorrect. Under the former law, parents could, and many did, homeschool under the annual assessment option. This option does not require any contact with a mandatory reporter. Ever since Iowa has had a homeschool law, families have been able to homeschool without a requirement that they contact a mandatory reporter. And at the risk of stating the obvious, Sabrina Ray and Natalie Finn were both 16 when their beautiful lives were cut short by criminals. They were beyond the age when their parents would have needed to comply with the homeschool laws. So all these proposed changes to the homeschool laws may have helped them not one bit. So, what is that beast in the grass? Fear makes us seek a pattern. Fear that the beast will hurt us or someone we care about. What is that pattern we trace in the stars when there really is no pattern? For some homeschooled young adults who feel deeply wronged by their parents or identify closely with those who have been wronged, they trace this message in the stars. Homeschool parents are dangerous child abusers. For people who believe that adoptive parents don't love their kids like biological parents, they trace this message in the stars. Adoptive parents are dangerous abusers. For people who believe that the financial adoption subsidies these criminals received brought out the worst in them, they trace this message in the stars. People who get paid to adopt kids are dangerous abusers. For people who have deep-seated and sincere philosophical differences with Terry Branstad, they trace this message in the stars. Branstad doesn't care about kids and let these tragedies go unabated. For people who have very low confidence levels in government in general, they trace this message in the stars. Social workers, from the highest to the lowest, are incompetent. But there are no patterns in the stars. We may as well take our fingers out of the stars and come down to the plain old, uninspiring earth. And down on earth, we see that CCANF and many others have said the same thing. The kids most at risk during an investigation are those as to whom the report was previously filed. Some members of these committees heard this testimony during an informal hearing some weeks ago. Quote, "A history of past child services reports and intervention is the #1 theme we see in the homeschooled child fatalities we review." So, here's my suggestion. Create a law, regulation, or policy that when any family gets a second report of child abuse or neglect, our response is much more muscular. Muscular in accurately nailing down the facts, and muscular in providing help. Talk to your most experienced child protective workers. They can help you on this. Talk to the team that made child deaths plummet in Hillsborough, Florida. They can help you. CCANF predicts that 2,100 children will die annually in America from abuse and neglect. With 1% of the nation's population, Iowa's proportionate share would be about 21 per year. Unless we change the course of history, most of them will die anonymously, unheralded by the press because their deaths are not interesting enough to generate clicks, and unsung by elected leaders because their deaths would generate little voter interest. I believe we can get that number down dramatically if we get our fingers out of the stars, make a conscious decision to not point those fingers at each other, and move forward using the data CCANF has worked so hard to give us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Scott. Are you willing to take a few questions?
I would be happy to, yes, sir.
Representative Finkenauer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for being here with us today. And respectfully, I have got to say, I do not care about what is written in any stars. I care about what is happening in the state of Iowa and the data that we have before us and what has happened to 2 girls who were murdered and the trajectory that they went down. That's what we need to be talking about today. And, sir.
This case is still under investigation, and murder has not been proven.
Killed.
Strike that language and say death or died or whatever. Don't say they were killed. Don't say they were murdered. That's not been concluded yet by the justices. Oh, come on.
Representative Finkenauer.
Fair enough.
Thank you.
2 girls.
In the audience, please keep your voices down.
2 girls.
I'm not going to ask again, or you'll be asked to leave. Your voices are to be kept down so the committee members can speak freely. One more time and you're gone. Please proceed.
2 girls who have died in our state and 1 that escaped, all with the exact same trajectory. And unfortunately, it does have, it ends with these children being homeschooled. So that is what we're talking about. I am not somebody who thinks all homeschooled parents are terrible. I would never say that. I don't believe that at all. In fact, I'm sitting next to 2 of them who I'm sure are wonderful. But I am somebody who is very concerned about the fact that what we're dealing with here today are girls who have gone from, and children who have gone from foster care to special needs adoptions to then becoming homeschooled to then essentially falling off the radar and have been or are now dead. So my question to you would be, with your knowledge of homeschooling and the policies that you've seen across the country, and I'm sure you've seen quite a bit, what could we do differently here? I know you're saying this is not in the stars, all of that. I understand you to an extent, but the fact is this is what we are seeing here in Iowa. So are there any policies that you would suggest that we could look at where we are respectful of homeschooled parents, but the homeschool parents I know are, they're good people that also want to make sure that, we don't have children falling off the radar here and are dying in our state. They don't want to see that either. So how do we deal with that? What are your suggestions?
Look at CCANF. Their number one recommendation is devise a strategy based on the well-established, statistically valid risk factors for kids. The number one risk factor is a prior report to social services. Develop a policy, a law, a regulation that requires social services to have a much more muscular response when any family gets a second report, instead of treating them all alike or instead of just disregarding them and not following up at all. Have a policy that says when a family gets number 2, you're going to jump on that, be vigorous, be muscular, regardless of how they choose to educate their kids. That's the kind of policy that saved lives in Hillsborough, Florida. That's the kind of policy that saved lives in Wichita, Kansas. That's the kind of policy that can and will save lives in Iowa.
I appreciate that. And I do also, I want to point out something that we've heard from a few people earlier as well. And I think it was the Polk County Assistant Attorney as well as Ms. Rickman, that our public schools are often work hand in hand with DHS and that they are an extra safety net. So I am concerned, and this is something I think we're going to have to look into, is how what's that safety net when these children end up homeschooled? We take that away then. So I'm concerned about that, and that is part of this discussion, and I hope we can continue to look into that further. Thank you.
Chair recognizes Senator McCoy.
Thank you, Mr. Woodruff, for being here today, and thanks for sharing this report. I do believe there's validity in the argument that where there is frequency, there's severity. And so when you have prior issues of abuse like we've had in Iowa and it gets handled appropriately, then it can be very effective as a predictive indicator for future abuse and more severe abuse. Because I've always believed that abuse will breed severity if left unchecked. Tell me a little bit about your organization, just so that I can fully understand the organization that you represent. Your Legal Defense?
Correct.
So who are you defending?
The organization was founded in 1983. At that time, the modern expression of homeschooling was something new, although homeschooling is definitely the oldest form of education in Western civilization, but in the early 80s, it was making a comeback, and it hadn't been used much in the modern era. So families were finding that when they wanted to homeschool, they would often be accused of violating laws that didn't exist, or they would be prosecuted based on flimsy evidence, or they encountered laws that actually made homeschooling illegal. And they found that individual families on their own couldn't afford a vigorous first-class defense. And so 2 attorneys got together, Mike Smith, Mike Ferris. They said, hey, you know what? People are asking us to defend them for free. You know, this is not a good economic model. This is not going to work. So they came up with the idea that if they created an organization people could join and pay some kind of an annual membership fee, then when any member of the association were placed in legal jeopardy because of their decision to homeschool, that the resources would be there to provide them with a quality legal defense.
It's my understanding that you represent about 6% of homeschool families.
I can't really give you an accurate answer to that. We have about 80,000 member families nationwide. I couldn't say 6% is wrong, but I can't tell you positively it's correct. We have about 80,000 member families nationwide.
Okay. In 2013, you opposed a Pennsylvania bill that would have required a risk assessment when a child was withdrawn from school to be homeschooled within 18 months of a founded abuse or neglect report. My question to you is, if you truly believe that frequency causes severity, then why would you oppose a measure to withhold a family's right to homeschool within 18 months of a founded abuse case?
I was not the attorney taking care of a Pennsylvania legislative...
But your organization was.
Our organization definitely worked on the issue, but I don't want to tell you stuff that I can't personally tell you is true, and I wasn't the attorney assigned to work on that issue, but I did look into it just a little bit, and I actually read the entire recommendation on the Task Force on Child Protection, and on page 60, this quotation is found. The task force received testimony from prosecutors and physicians regarding specific instances of child abuse and neglect occurring in homeschool settings where families have had prior involvement in the child welfare system. So this, unquote. So this goes back to my recommendation, which is in line with CCANT, which is if a family is now working on their second report, you develop a more muscular response, regardless of how they want to educate their kids.
But the Pennsylvania bill, to be very technical, would only require that families who had a founded case of abuse within 18 months actually be not allowed to use the homeschool option because it took away a safety net. Let's move on to a second case. A second case was in Detroit. After a homeschooled child was found in a freezer, a bill was introduced that would require parents to notify the states annually that they were homeschooling, to have their children meet twice a year with a mandatory reporter such as a teacher, doctor, or member of the clergy. Again, very similar to legislation which I've offered to this legislature. You oppose that measure. Why?
I really hate to let you down, Senator, but I was not the attorney in the office responsible for Michigan at that time, and so I can't give you the fine-grained answer you would like, but allow this to suffice. Pennsylvania, as I said in my opening testimony, already has a law that mandates that homeschoolers receive mental, dental, vision, height, weight checks, and tuberculosis tests, and there's no credible evidence that that actually produces any benefit for homeschooled children.
So the third case is a 2005 case where the Homeschool Legal Defense Network responded to allegations that homeschool father Michael Graybill was keeping his 11 adopted children in cages by praising Graybill. They had nothing to hide. HSLDA, which is your organization, Scott Somerville, are you familiar with him?
I know Scott Somerville. I'm Scott Woodruff, but I do know Scott Somerville.
Okay, he told the press, he told me why they adopted these children and told me what their problems were and what he was trying to solve. And he stated, "I think he is a hero." Graybill and his wife were later convicted of 2 misdemeanor and 4 felony counts of child endangering and 5 misdemeanor counts of child abuse. Are you comfortable with that defense of Mr. Graybill?
If you'd like to know why Mr. Somerville said that, He would be the best person to ask. He is still alive. He doesn't work for HSLDA at this time. He would be the best person to respond to what he said.
Okay, very good. Well, as you know, Iowa has has had a successful homeschooling program. In 2013, we amended our program, and I think we made a mistake. And what we did was we allowed competent private instruction in the home with no reporting. And we allowed parents to opt out, even in cases where there is truancy. And in fact, I don't know whether you're familiar with Dr. Barbara Knox out of Wisconsin, University of Wisconsin, a pediatrician and a person that did a lot of work. And what she found in Wisconsin is when abuse was reported in schools by mandatory reporters, there was a 47% increase in parents withdrawing their child from school, from the school that they were attending, and choosing the homeschool option so as to not have those agitators, mandatory reporters, checking on the welfare of the child. And so in Iowa, we passed this reckless, senseless, gutless bill that essentially requires no accountability and it requires absolutely no measure for keeping track of the child. We don't even know they exist. They go completely dark. And if you live in a rural setting and you're a perpetuator, if you perpetuate child abuse, you can then victimize your victim by isolation. And that's my fear. And so I appreciate your comments about, I halfway agree with you as it relates to if you've got a case out there of one founded case, that's a good indicator that there's going to be more problems down the road. That's a better indicator. But I'm also concerned about a system that is so reckless and so far away from accountability that we leave children in a very vulnerable position. But I still believe that it is every parent's right to homeschool a child within certain parameters. And I think a well-being check with a physician and a school psychologist or healthcare provider on a quarterly or semi-annual basis ought to be the way we tackle this problem. And I think we could work together to do that. Thank you very much.
Chair recognizes Representative Wolf.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Sir, I just wanted to circle back to the comment you made about truancy and how even if a parent pulls their child out of school in order to hypothetically avoid a truancy prosecution, they can still be prosecuted. That's true. However, under Iowa Law 299.6, the penalty for a conviction of truancy for a first-time conviction, it's a simple misdemeanor. It's either up to 10 days in jail or a fine of up to $100. For a second-time conviction, it's a penalty of either up to, I believe, 20 days in jail and a fine, or a fine of up to $500. So I don't think that there's any way a court would have authority to order parents as a condition of probation to not homeschool their children. So I do think, hypothetically, under Iowa's current law, parents, in worst case scenario, you have a child who isn't showing up for school, who when they do show up, there's some concerns. The school gets involved and asks to talk to the parents about the fact that the child is missing a lot of school and what's going on there. If a parent then says, you know what, I'm going to pull my child out of school and homeschool him under the code section that basically allows no further interaction between the child and the school authorities, possibly there could be a prosecution for truancy for the missed days that happen, but that would be difficult to prove. And then, again, at the most, that parent could be sentenced to a jail sentence of 10 days or a fine. So, thanks.
Just a quick question on protocol. I'm appreciating the conversation. I'm sort of attuned to the idea of only talking when a question has been asked to me. The last two parts of the conversations were interesting, but they didn't ask me a question. Should I feel free to respond even though there wasn't a question?
And so, I mean, I guess you indicated that you thought a judge could, in fact, order parents who had been convicted of truancy to not put their child into homeschooling. I'm just wondering what you're basing that on.
That's my understanding. If I'm wrong, I'd be glad to have someone point that out to me. But my understanding was that under Iowa law, if someone has been convicted of truancy, that could feed into a definition of a child in need of services or assistance.
Sure. So that would be a separate issue if it could be a ground, probably not the only ground of a China proceeding, but certainly as a condition of a conviction. I have a really loud voice. Yeah, I'm just saying a person could not be ordered by a judge to keep their kid in school based on a conviction for truancy. That could not be a condition of their sentence. They couldn't be sentenced to that.
Right. Well, but the conviction could then set the predicate for the China or Chen's petition.
I could. Are you aware of any cases in which a child has been adjudicated a child in need of assistance based on missing school in and of itself?
In other states, yes. In Iowa, no.
Thank you.
And Mr. Woodruff, please feel free, if you've been addressed without a question you'd like to respond, please feel free to do so.
I would request leave to respond to Senator McCoy's suggestion that the 2013 reforms were reckless. I simply want to say that I don't think that's an accurate characterization. Those reforms brought Iowa much closer into the mainstream of the homeschool trend around the country. There are many states where families are not required to go through the routine of filing a piece of paper before they can homeschool. There are many states where they aren't required to go through the routine of filing a test at the end of the year. The overall trend, overwhelmingly, is to reduce wasteful red tape for homeschool families. For example, just last year, Arkansas abolished all mandatory testing. The year before that, South Dakota abolished testing for second graders. A couple years before that, Arizona abolished all testing. So the overall arc of history here is that having proven that homeschooling is a success, legislators are saying, okay, we don't need to treat homeschooling like a bunch of suspicious brand X. When homeschooling laws were first being developed, including when Iowa's first was developed, homeschooling was viewed with wholesale skepticism. There was very little research on how the kids would do academically, very little research on how the kids would do socially, and frankly, lawmakers were probably justified in being kind of skeptical and putting some pretty crazy requirements on homeschoolers. But social scientists love to do research, and they love to do research about homeschooling. And what they found out overwhelmingly is that homeschool kids do tremendously academically. They do very well socially. For example, have you had any big Iowa employer come to you and say, the homeschool kids who work for me can't read manuals. They steal from us. They can't follow instructions. You probably haven't had those calls. Has the University of Iowa called you and said, hey, the homeschool kids we take into the college, they can't read, they can't write, they're all flunking out. I don't think you've gotten calls like that. So over time, the combination of social research and the fact that homeschool kids have tended to shine in whatever endeavor they pursue has caused legislatures to kind of rethink and say, okay, these initial onerous requirements probably really are not necessary. And so the 2013 changes were entirely within the modern trend of placing less wasteful red tape on homeschool families.
Chair recognizes Representative Winchittle.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Scott, for being here today. Thank you for the manual and for the suggestion of a second strike, stronger penalty. I think that is an approach that may work. In response to some of the things Senator McCoy said, Senator McCoy, many of us in the House were at the heart of those reforms in that 2013 education reform package. I don't find them to be reckless, and I don't find them to be dangerous. I'll just make a simple statement that I believe that we can find a solution to the problems that we have seen occur here in our state without infringing upon parents' God-given rights, without putting a government requirement on them to tell them how to best be parents, whether that be biological parents or adoptive parents. So I look forward to working with the members of this committee and the rest of the legislature to find the solutions to the problems without infringing upon Iowans' rights. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Scott, thank you very much for your time. We appreciate your time, and if anybody in the committee needs to ask any further questions, I'm sure you'd be happy to answer.
Sure, and even if that means after this meeting, my number is 540-338-5600. I respect all the questions. You all are awesome, and I'd be happy to help and continue this conversation any way you'd like.
Thank you. Okay, to conclude the meeting, we are going to have closing remarks. It's been a long day, so I'm going to put a confinement on them for all of us. 5 minutes, and I'm going to hold up a marker when we're at 30 seconds. That I'm confined to those rules, Senator Breitbach's confined to those rules, we're all confined to those rules. And so to begin with, Chair recognizes Representative Finkenauer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Again, a big thank you to everybody who came today. This is something that I know affects a lot of people across the state of Iowa, and we have a lot of people very concerned. To the families that are here, again, you are the ones that I see here quite a bit. When Senator McCoy was organizing the meetings 5 months ago, you've been here from the beginning. So I would like to say and suggest that we do end up having more meetings down the road where we can hear from the families and their situations and what they're dealing with, because we have got to make this process better. And this should not be, again, Democratic or Republican. This should be about making the system work for our kids and for our families, and I'm very concerned about that. I also am thankful that we had our last guest here, I'm sorry his name, Scott. You know, I was actually not aware of the Pennsylvania law where homeschooled children would have to have checks by the doctors. I had no idea that that was something another state did. And when I heard that and he said that that would not have stopped what happened here in Iowa, I vehemently disagree. Sabrina Ray was 55 pounds or 65 pounds. I'm sorry, my facts are not completely correct on that. But incredibly malnourished, never should have happened, never. And had we had the laws that Pennsylvania has, I do believe that she would not be dead today, to be honest with you. I worry about the other children right now who are in similar situations that we don't know about. And I ask my colleagues to seriously consider this when we are looking, and I don't know if we even get to wait until next legislative session. We have 2 girls who are dead in the state of Iowa. We have one that escaped. We have got to move, and we've got to move now. And I don't know if what we're going to get from this outside group coming in looking at our system is going to be enough. It's going to require us to do something. So yes, I'm happy to hear what they have to say, but the fact is, if we would have had those laws in the books like Pennsylvania, I don't think those girls would be dead. So we have got to think about that. And also, I would be remiss if I did not say again, thank you, Senator McCoy. You know, it's been an honor to be a ranking member across the aisle from you in the House while you were in the Senate, and you did not shy away from this subject whatsoever at all when the first death happened. So thank you. And I also want to apologize for people in this room who had to see a lack of decorum earlier. That was not how these meetings should be ran. That's not what we should be doing. This is not what public service is about. What public service is about is being here, talking about the issues, asking the tough questions. There were no time limits on people asking questions. Maybe that should have been done, but that was not the case. And so to act the way that the chairs up here acted, I apologize that y'all had to witness that, because we have got to do better in the state of Iowa. We got to add a little bit more civility to this, because this is about 2 girls who are dead. These are about more children that we don't know about yet, and God forbid it happens again. And we must do, it is our right, it is our duty as state legislators to do what we can to make sure it does not happen again. So I ask you to join me in that. I thank you, Representative Kaufman. I called you after the second death happened, and you were, adamant, and we both were, that there must be a meeting. So thank you for that as well. But there's most likely now, after today, there's just so much to this. We are going to have to do more. And I've realized that today, and I think we all have as well. So I look forward to working with all the committee members, both in the Senate and in the House, both Democratic and Republican, and doing what's best for our kids and just making sure we get better laws on the books to protect our most vulnerable in this state. So thank you.
Chair recognizes Senator McCoy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for your passion. I think that we're at a point now where the state has an inherent responsibility to provide a safer environment for the children of Iowa. We need to examine fully our foster and adoptive care system, focusing on process of recruiting, screening, training, and monitoring of foster parents. In addition, we have to become involved in the process of screening, monitoring adoptive parents that want to adopt or foster in particular. I think that one of the challenges is, as a state, we have outsourced that responsibility, and I think Representative Heaton says how a Cedar Rapids-based firm that's responsible for recruiting a Keokuk family gets that done is difficult to understand. And I'm with you, Representative Heaton. In addition, I think we have to continue the process of oversight. The focus of the process of recruiting, screening, training, monitoring also involves understanding fully how Title IV-E money is used in the system and how parents are, in essence, compensated for providing care for these children within the home. And that's a very ugly subject to talk about, but I think we've seen many examples where the motivator for special needs children, taking on special needs children in the home, were cases where money was a factor. That's all I'm going to say about that. The real problem is I think we have a very difficult and disastrous budget as we move forward. We have less staff, we have higher caseloads, and a lack of real strong government oversight to be addressed. And so I think if we're going to be successful, we have to carefully examine how we're spending our money, what our resources are going to, and how we can power up and strengthen the use of staff in the field. We call, I do call on Governor Reynolds, and I know she's new in her position, but I believe that she's in a position to fix this deadly mistake by implementing changes immediately by transferring money through executive order into the area of field services, specifically related to adding more caseworkers in the field, especially in the heavily burdened counties like we heard of today in Polk County, where there's more than 50 cases being assigned to a worker. And then I think we need to do our jobs as oversight, and we need to make sure that we hold not only the Department of Human Services, but ourselves and the executive branch to a standard as it relates to oversight. I think this review of DHS that DHS wants to partake in is just a first step. I hope they will bring me to the table in that process. I hope they will bring others around this table who want to be involved in that process. I want someone to fully address why Iowa's Child Death Review Team is not meeting and why they have agreed not to launch private investigations into the deaths of these children. And I would like to engage Prevent Child Abuse Iowa to help us develop best practices and how to improve the Iowa system. Finally, I would like to work closely with the Youth Law Center of Iowa and lawyers representing children in protective cases, and specifically guardian ad litems. I was concerned by what the judge said today as it related to knowing that some of the guardian ad litems that he thinks should have 50 cases had double that, and it's impossible for them to meet with the kids individually and actually see them and actually know what's going on. And then finally, I do think we need to work cooperatively in a bipartisan way on how we can reform Iowa's homeschool laws to better reflect the best practices as it relates to ensuring that children are seen by mandatory reporters. I thank everyone for their involvement. I've literally received hundreds of calls and letters. I haven't gotten back to everybody. I'm trying. But I will say that Iowans are passionate about this issue, and they care very deeply about it, and I find that very encouraging. Thank you, gentlemen, for holding this hearing.
Chair recognizes Senator Breitbach.
Thank you. I too have concerns about caseloads with the DHS. Hopefully we'll be able to look into this and make sure that even though we may have an average that is low, that we make sure that we don't have pockets that are overburdened. I would hope that apparently DHS employees have felt safe to contact other members of the committee. However, they have not contacted me. I wish they would. Trust me, you have my confidence, and I will keep your confidence in me and not share your information if you don't want it shared, but I would appreciate your input. Representative Finkenauer, I too was appalled at the outburst earlier today. When a point of order is called, normally the offending member stops talking. That is the point. I was very, very dismayed about the actions of some of the people at the table. I was also appalled to see that it was already posted online that we shut people out of this conversation that are on this board or on this committee. I don't feel that anyone was shut out, and I was very dismayed with that post. I would not expect to see another. I would rather work together. You talk about bipartisanship, let's work together then. Talk to me personally if you want to. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll just conclude with a few closing remarks, and then we will adjourn. I had some prepared remarks. I'm not known for my prepared remarks, but there's so many things to cover I wanted to. But first, I too am going to address this alleged outburst. A point of order means point of order. That means the member stops talking. And it is my job to make sure that every member of this committee gets an equal chance to talk, and it's our job to listen. And when someone goes on for 23 straight minutes with 8 people still on the list and is no longer asking questions but rather making political statements, it is absolutely our job to point of order. It's absolutely our job to make sure this meeting is run smoothly. People such as sheriffs and deputies and people that were coming from across the state dedicated their day to coming here, not to listen to political speeches. So I don't regret that one bit. In fact, I'd do it again. But that being said, and one final comment, if you want to work together and be bipartisan, quit being so partisan. There are many things today that had an impact on me. This committee, the Oversight Committee, has had a long history of fighting for privacy. We've worked on eminent domain I think there is a distinction personally between someone who is fully adopted versus someone who's continuing to receive a paycheck for that adoption. I think under those circumstances, it's worth discussion to see if there might be further review, to see if there might need to be a doctor's visit, for instance, if you're receiving taxpayer money. I think Mr. Woodruff's suggestion of significantly more muscle put into the response for repeat offenders has found bipartisan support already, and I think that's also a cause that's worth exploring. Representative Wolf, your suggestion of digging deeper into the placement policies, I agree with you, and I'd like to do that. Many are going to ask me, and many have already asked me, when is our next meeting? Well, my first answer is I don't know. We just had 6 hours of testimony, 6 hours of powerful testimony. I have a book, a packet, and 7 pages of notes to review too. So it might be a good soundbite to declare the next meeting is going to be right now, but frankly, there's things that I need to digest, there's things that the chair needs to digest, and I would like to work with all of you to determine the agenda on what we do proceeding going forward. We have a new director coming in at some point. What he or she does may completely turn around how we do things. I'm not interested in taking the committee down a rabbit hole. And I'm also interested in being kept apprised, and I've asked DHS to keep us apprised as a committee of what happens with this external review. So with that, I do also hope that we can work together. I think that we can find solutions without being partisan. And as far as our next step, the best thing I can do to tell you today is that I'm going to digest all of this, work with each of my members. I will touch base with each of you individually, and then I will get back with you. With that, is there any further business to come before the committee? Seeing none, Representative Hartzell moves that we adjourn.